The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. And good morning, and thank you all for coming today. When Donald Trump was inaugurated in 2017, many of us worried about the danger that a Republican administration could pose to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people's rights. When Donald Trump campaigned, he gave lip service to caring about LGBTQ rights. But immediately after he took office, his administration began undermining vital LGBTQ rights. The White House started out by removing all mentions of LGBTQ rights or people from its website, and it has gone down since then. The Trump administration quickly dismantled important legal and regulatory protections for LGBTQ people. It adopted discriminatory rules and undermined protections for LGBTQ people. LGBTQ people face real dangers in our society. A month ago, a transgender woman, Serena Donnelly, was physically attacked in a New York subway by individuals who yelled homophobic slurs at her. I was horrified that this hate crime happened in the city I represent, New York City, one of the most progressive cities in the world. Transphobia, racism, and homophobia are real, and LGBTQ people face real harms and real violence in their daily lives. And that is precisely why the federal government must act to protect all LGBTQ people against harm. One of the most cynical aspects of the administration's effort is how it has emboldened discrimination by distorting claims of religious liberty. The Trump administration is dividing America and pitting American citizens against each other. That is a false choice. For years, federal law has protected the rights of individuals and organizations to observe religious and moral tenets without unduly burdening the health and welfare of others. Let me make one thing crystal clear. I am a strong supporter of religious liberty, but it should not be distorted and twisted into a weapon to enable discrimination. Scrubbing the White House website of references to gay people has nothing to do with religious freedom. It has everything to do with the Trump administration's assault on the LGBTQ community. Today, we will hear directly from some of our distinguished colleagues who understand the importance of protecting and strengthening rights of all people, including the LGBTQ community. We will also hear from witnesses on the forefront of the fight for LGBTQ equality, including individuals who have personally felt the impact of anti-LGBTQ discrimination. The Oversight Committee will continue to combat this administration's abuses, and we will support our friends and neighbors who are being unfairly targeted by the President and his administration. I want to add one last thing. The House passed the Equality Act on a bipartisan basis on May 17, 2017. That bill would add explicit protections against discrimination for LGBTQ individuals. The Equality Act is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. Senator McConnell won't even give us the courtesy of a debate, even though senators from his own party support the bill. I would urge him to change his stance. This is an issue of the utmost importance for our friends, our neighbors, our children, and our colleagues. America deserves a debate and a vote on the Equality Act. With that, I'd like to thank my good friend Jamie Raskin for his leadership on this important issue as chairman of our subcommittee on civil rights and civil liberties, and I yield to him.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate very much your calling this hearing for the full committee, and I welcome all of our witnesses today. The extraordinary transformation that our country's experienced in the last decade on the question of marriage equality illuminates pretty much everything we need to know about how to reconcile the principles of individual religious freedom and equal protection under the law for all people. Equal protection means that everyone, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation, must enjoy equal rights under the law. That means that the institution of civil marriage cannot be roped off to discriminate against millions of gay and lesbian citizens for no compelling reason. And as the court found in the Obergefell decision, other people's moral or religious disapproval of gay people getting married cannot constitute a compelling reason for canceling out their fundamental right to marry the person that they love. So we learned that no matter how much same-sex marriage violates your religious scruples and beliefs, you have no religious liberty right to impose your position through law and government on other people to interfere with their freedom. This is a principle so powerful that the Supreme Court struck down discriminatory and exclusionary marriage provisions that had been on the books for centuries. The successful struggle over marriage equality liberated millions of people to participate on an equal basis in this central institution in society. It also established a new norm for inclusion and equal rights that has encouraged the LGBTQ community to demand full equal rights across the board. But it did not leave anyone in our country with diminished religious freedom. If a state or a city ordered a church, mosque, or synagogue to conduct religious weddings for same-sex couples, the churches would absolutely win their right not to do so. They have a First Amendment free exercise right to marry or not marry exactly who they please within their own churches. The Constitution decides who gets married in City Hall, but the church decides who gets married in the church hall. This is a central aspect of religious free exercise. The big question has been whether private businesses in the stream of commerce, like restaurants, movie theaters, and apartment buildings, or federally funded organizations like hospitals and foster care agencies, can decide not to serve, rent to, or do business with LGBTQ Americans if they are obligated to do so under law, but assert that it would violate their religious beliefs to do so. There may be a handful of close calls in harmonizing individual religious freedom and equal rights, but the vast majority of cases are in fact easy. Yet, alas, the Trump administration has been working zealously to turn the government into an instrument of hostility and opposition towards LGBTQ rights across the executive branch of government. Since Inauguration Day, the administration has worked to purge all mention of LGBTQ rights and to systematically roll back protections for that community in federal law and policy. Following inauguration, agencies across the executive branch began undermining and stripping vital protections. The Trump administration Department of Justice has filed several amicus briefs advocating for legal interpretations that erode civil liberty protections. DOJ also filed an amicus brief in the Masterpiece cake shop case, arguing that a cake shop owner does not have to serve gay customers because it violates the First Amendment to force him to create expression for and participate in a ceremony that violates his sincerely held religious beliefs. This is the exact same argument that the Supreme Court rejected in the 1960s in cases repudiating the alleged constitutional right of restaurant and lunch counter owners to refuse to serve African American and interracial parties as a burden on their religious or associational freedom. The Trump administration Department of Health and Human Services has similarly been instrumental in the campaign to end protections for LGBTQ individuals. The administration has rapidly turned religious liberty, in quotes, into a pretext and excuse for denying LGBTQ citizens the ability to participate equally in all aspects of the economy in society. On May 2nd last year, HHS finalized a rule that dramatically expanded the ability of healthcare providers to deny services based on religious or moral objections. The administration cited the case of our witness, Evan Minton, as an example of the need for the rule in order to permit more discrimination against patients like him. The Trump administration has used everything in its power, including executive orders, litigation decisions, amicus briefs, and agency guidance and regulations to undermine protections for LGBTQ people and expand the availability of religious exemptions. These actions go against the true meaning of both religious liberty and equal protection under the law. These two values stand best when they stand together. Indeed, the religious liberty of the people is protected by vigorous enforcement of equal protection in the Establishment Clause. As Madison emphasized, the major threat to my religious freedom comes from another person or group's capture of state power and their use of government to impose their religious dogma and control on everyone else. Today, the equal rights of the LGBTQ community are threatened by the administration's determination to pass out licenses to discriminate based on the rampant misinterpretation of the meaning of religious liberty. Thank you for calling the hearing, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I now yield to Mr. Heiss, Ranking Member, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and our fellow representatives, thank you, and the next panel to come. The title of the hearing today, The Administration's Religious Liberty Assault on LGBTQ Rights, is in itself, to me, a fundamental misconception of reality. To begin with, the notion that the Trump administration is somehow attacking the LGBTQ community is just wrong. The United States continues to be a world leader in guaranteeing the civil rights of all, including the LGBT community. And under President Trump, the federal government has sought to treat all Americans, gay or straight, religious, non-religious, fairly and justly. I think even given the recent nomination of Richard Grenell as Director of National Intelligence is yet another example of that. President Trump, in my opinion, is striving to bring the rest of the world into line with our country, which provides the greatest freedoms for all of our citizens. The freedom to believe, the freedom to speak freely, freedom to pray, freedom to associate. These are freedoms that allow all Americans to live according to their deeply held beliefs and convictions. And as we all know in this room, we've had individuals who have fought and died for these rights with Americans. And I believe it's important that we continue that. And I'm deeply concerned that we're living at a time where so many seem to misunderstand the meaning of the First Amendment. I mean, we're talking about inalienable rights, rights that we as a nation fundamentally believe have been given us by God, not by government. And right at the beginning of that is the First Amendment, where we're told that Congress shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. All right, so we see that Congress cannot mandate a national religion. We get that. But we also understand from this that neither can Congress prevent Americans from practicing their faith in the public square. And fundamentally, the First Amendment protects Americans from an ideological coercion from government. And this is the rub for me. The part that becomes difficult for many of us. But I believe, and I have seen personally, tragically, that for years now we have watched religious liberties in this country be under siege and attacks, often under the false guise of fighting discrimination and enforcing tolerance. And make no mistake, discrimination is wrong. It's un-American. And to fight against discrimination is worthy. It's the right thing to do. It's honorable in every way. But the right to disagree with someone without the government interfering to promote one viewpoint over another is at the core of what the First Amendment is all about. I think Supreme Court Justice Alito had it right when he warned all of us that using anti-discrimination laws as a backdoor to, quote, stamp out every vestige of dissent, end quote, is equally just as wrong. And I believe that's precisely what is at stake here. And I know we all have different views. I respect that. But my sincere concern is that too many on the left would like to shame and vilify millions of religious Americans and thousands of faith-based organizations nationwide simply because they don't share the same liberal beliefs as those on the left. And I believe many on the left have become relentless in trying to force others to accept their own views across society. For example, in 2017, the Supreme Court ruled that individuals cannot be targeted for their religious beliefs and that open hostility to religion has no place in our society. And yet, in spite of that, Masterpiece Cake Shop owner Jack Phillips was targeted not once, not twice, but 3 times because of his deeply held religious beliefs on marriage. Baronelle Stutzman, the florist, went through similar things. There are many examples. But targeting of this nature has now expanded far beyond its initial focus on artistic expression of a baker or a florist, and now the left is adopting these same tactics to create mandates forcing pharmacists to dispense chemical abortion drugs or medical professionals to perform abortions against their deeply held beliefs. Take, for example, the Little Sisters of the Poor. Obamacare forced them to provide contraceptives against their beliefs. And now that is going before the Supreme Court yet again. This is not religious freedom. And I believe that increasingly we're seeing Democrats want faith-based adoption foster care agencies to either violate their religious beliefs that it is their duty to place children in homes with moms and dads, or to shut down altogether, to do what the left wants, or to be excluded from operating in the public square. And when Catholic charities were shut down in Illinois, there were nearly 3,000 children displaced. So whatever our political or cultural views, I think surely we can all agree that vilifying well-intentioned and loving charities like faith-based foster homes does not help anyone. But this assault on religious liberties is certainly not confined to faith-based organizations all across America now. From schoolrooms to social media platforms, we're seeing social justice crusades increase against those who have not accepted the new cultural norms of the left. We saw, for example, when the Obama administration adopted the change to Title IX to impose gender identity mandates on federally funded schools. We saw many Christian colleges and universities trying to keep their exempt status, only to find themselves placed on shame lists where they have experienced massive pressure campaigns to relinquish their long-held religious beliefs on sexuality. In Florida, there's an activist campaign underway to attack and defund Christian schools that participate in educational tax credit programs. And those companies who support these scholarships of underprivileged children to get a better education, those companies themselves are experiencing massive pressure to defund these schools. And it's only the kids who end up suffering. Currently, the Virginia General Assembly is poised to adopt sexual orientation and gender identity legislation that I believe will severely impair freedom in religious schools. And unfortunately, I believe when all is said and done here, these are nothing but measures that open the door for government-mandated discrimination and coercion. And so this hearing really, to me, is an attempt really to polarize what has always been a unifying factor in American society and culture, and that is religious freedom. The right for everyone to live and express their beliefs in the public square. And in closing, I again just want to say thank you to each of you who are here, and for those who will be joining the next panel. I know without question we're going to hear some moving and compelling stories, and many of you have been through some very difficult times and have experienced discrimination, and for that I am deeply sorry. That kind of behavior should never happen in America, and you should never have experienced it. But at the same time, I wonder, where are the other witnesses, individuals who have lost virtually everything they've had because they have tried to stand for their religious beliefs and live according to those beliefs in the public square? And so I thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. Mike Kelly, thank you for being here today to share your perspective. Hiram Sasser, I'm looking forward to hearing as well. And to each of you, I want to thank you, and I look forward to our time together. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I will begin by welcoming our first panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, a member of the Maloney caucus, but not a relative, but a very good friend. He has represented New York's 18th congressional district since 2013. He is a co-chair of the Congressional LGBT Equality Caucus. Mark Takano, Congressman Takano, has represented California's 41st Congressional District since 2013. He is also co-chair of the Congressional Equality Caucus. Mike Kelly, he has represented the 3rd District of Pennsylvania since 2011, and Joe Kennedy III has represented Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District since 2013. He chairs the Congressional LGBT Caucus's Transgender Equality Task Force. He also introduced the Do No Harm Act. Mr. Maloney, Representative Maloney, you're recognized.
Thank you,
all.
Chairwoman. Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Heiss. Thank the committee for having this important hearing today. You know, in listening to the ranking member's opening remarks, I was thinking maybe the day will come where people like me and Mark, some of the people behind us, won't have to come in here like supplicants seeking our basic rights. And we won't be treated to expressions of discrimination dressed up as religious liberty. But even today, that is not the country we live in. You know, I've been with my husband for almost 28 years. We were allowed to get married just 5 years ago, and for 27 of those years, we've been raising children. We have 3 children. My oldest came to us when he was not quite 3 years old. He had been barely eating solid foods. He was sleeping in a drawer. He was living in squalor in one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York City. His parents were heroin addicts. They had 4 children. I think they loved their children. I know they loved drugs more, and they were unable to take care of them. And we didn't set out to be parents. This wasn't about fulfilling some desire we had. It was because someone asked us if we could help, and we said we would. And soon after that, his mom OD'd, and there was no one to bury her, so we did. And his dad went to jail, and there was no one to take care of this little boy, so we did. And it was the greatest thing that ever happened to us. We'd been together for 4 months as a couple. That young man is 30 years old today. And I think if you asked him, Representative Heiss, about the family he was raised in, well, let's just say I'd go with what he has to say about the ability of LGBT couples to parent and to foster. And you know, it was a few years later that an adoption agency called us from Texas, sir, a group called the Adoption Alliance that was licensed in Texas and Nevada. And the reason they were calling us in New York was not because we were seeking to adopt. It was because they had learned in the 1990s that there were certain types of kids who were not going to be adopted, where the circumstances of their birth, through no fault of their own, obviously, was difficult or confronting for traditional adoptive parents, where there were issues of HIV or rape or incest, sometimes mixed with concerns about interracial adoption. And what these adoption agencies learned, to their credit, was that there were LGBT couples in cities like New York who would say yes to these children. Not as an alternative to the straight couple that was going to raise them, as an alternative to never being adopted, because no one was going to adopt these kids. And it was that insight that LGBT couples were willing to cross lines of difference because they had experienced doing so in their own lives, that they had less preoccupation or hysteria with things like HIV, that they were more willing to adopt across lines of difference like race or religion, that there was an opportunity for kids that would not have a home to have a home. And so it is because of that that on January 10th, 2001, I learned of my oldest daughter, who had been born just 5 days earlier. We had no intention of adopting. That she had been born in Texas to a United States military member, to the granddaughter of a United States military member. Her mom was 14 years old. She didn't even know she was pregnant. She was playing basketball and complained of cramps and delivered the baby when the doctors thought she had appendicitis. And they called us because no one else was going to do it. And so 13 days later, my partner and I were standing in front of a Texas judge at 8 o'clock in the morning before his docket started, and he said, "Are you fellas going to raise this child?" And we said, "Yes, sir." And he finalized the adoption on the spot. No rescission rights in the state of Texas. 13 days after that child was born, she was home in New York with 2 loving parents, and that child is 19 years old today and a freshman at John Jay College in New York. And she's a beautiful young woman. And she would not have had a mom and a dad. So you keep having them, and we'll keep raising them, is the way we felt about it. Did she deserve a mom and a dad? Yes, she did. But she also deserved people who loved her, who were going to raise her. And that is what is at stake today. Our third child, the adoption agency, same one, 2 years later, came to us, same story, very similar. They sought out LGBTQ parents because they knew they would adopt when others wouldn't. So the point is when you allow people to discriminate against those couples, you deprive children of good moms, dads, families who are going to love them. And when you dress it up as religious liberty, you simply sanction discrimination and deprive those children of a home that they deserve. And so we're here because the Trump administration, as we know, has green-lighted license discriminate laws to allow federally funded organizations to discriminate against adoptive and foster parents who don't share the organization's religious beliefs, and that means also LGBTQ parents and people of other religions won't be able to adopt. And those kids are the ones that are going to lose. Hundreds of thousands of kids who need foster parents, who need adoptive parents. That is the collateral damage that will ensue if we allow these discriminatory practices to occur under the guise of religious freedom. Our only goal when providing child services should be looking out for the best interests of the kids. That's all that matters. LGBTQ couples are not afraid of that test. Parents are parents. Good parents are good parents. Bad parents are bad parents. And it doesn't matter what they look like, who they love. So I've, of course, joined my colleagues in writing the Secretary of Health and Human Services opposing the South Carolina waiver, allowing federally funded foster care agencies to deny services to same-sex and non-Christian couples, making clear that his agency is misusing federal law to allow these organizations to discriminate against LGBTQ people and other people of other religions. I support Representative Candy's Do No Harm Act, which is so important to clarify that religious exemption from laws guaranteeing fundamental civil and legal rights is not a license to discriminate. I'm also here today in support of the Every Child Deserves a Family Act, so we can put an end to these bigoted restrictions once and for all. So I want to thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for your leadership on this issue. I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Candy and Representative Takano. I want to thank my colleague, Mike Kelly, for being here today. I know his beliefs are sincerely held, but I believe they are profoundly misguided and will create real damage to families like mine. But I respect him as a person of faith. You know, I would close by saying that LGBTQ people are also people of faith. One of the most frustrating misunderstandings is the notion that this is a disagreement between people of faith and people without faith. It is an act of faith to care and love for a child. And so it is because of our faith, not in spite of it, that we oppose these discriminatory measures. And we'll keep fighting these hateful rules down in Washington because every child deserves a home. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Takano.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for convening this historic hearing, and Acting Ranking Member Jody Highs for the opportunity to address the committee. I'm Congressman Takano, Mark Takano, and I represent California's 41st District. I also serve as one of the 7 co-chairs for the Congressional LGBT Equality Caucus. The caucus is comprised of 169 members, LGBT people and allies who all share one basic value: the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And I do want to address a couple of things that the acting ranking member sort of claimed in his opening statement. He talked a lot about the ability to express one's religious beliefs in the public square, and I have no problem with that. We have a robust tradition of that in our country, and our country was founded by people coming from Europe who were suppressed and weren't able to do that and were punished. But we need to make a distinction between the public square and public accommodation and entities that are supported by federal dollars or entities that are given certain kinds of dispensations, tax-free status because of what they are. And we have certain expectations that anything favored by the government or supported by the government treats all people equally. So the public square is different from this idea of public accommodation. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he was traveling around our country in the early 1800s, noting the differences between the old world of Europe and this new democracy in America, he was very curious to see how religion operated in America. And he, as I recall, he noted the corruption that occurred when the state favored religion, and that the religion itself became corrupt. And he saw the possibility that in America, where religions had to compete on equal ground for the souls of Americans, that kept religions more pure. And so I offer that as a kind of way to look at how we regard religion in America, that the government has to be this neutral place, neither favoring or disfavoring any religion. And that if that taxpayer dollars go to an institution, that institution has to treat everyone fairly and cannot discriminate and cannot use religious liberty as the reasoning for why it would discriminate. Now, as a former teacher, I'm particularly attuned to the ways in which children are affected by government and policies, because LGBTQ children are very, very vulnerable. The rates of suicide are much higher among young Americans who are LGBTQ. Now, the gentleman noted the appointment of Richard Grinnell as evidence that this administration bears no ill will toward LGBTQ people. Well, I'm going to say that the appointment of one gay person to an important post does not compensate for the systematic discrimination against LGBT people that affect millions of people. So one person is not evidence of a benign executive. It's actually an insidious argument. So let me just sort of outline these policies that have been pursued by the Trump administration, despite the president's claims that he was going to be for LGBTQ people in his campaign. In the spring of 2019, the Housing and Urban Development Department proposed changes, HUD, proposed changes to the Equal Access Rule, which would allow shelters to explicitly discriminate against transgender people. They want to make it harder for LGBTQ people who suffer from high rates of homelessness to put a roof over their heads. This is an example of a systematic discrimination against LGBTQ people through policy. And the appointment of one person who's LGBTQ to an important post does not compensate for that. Last fall, the Trump administration made legal arguments before the Supreme Court that would limit non-discrimination protections under Title VII, which exists to prevent people from being fired for their sexual orientation. They want to give employers the power to fire you based solely on who you are or who you love. I say religious liberty does not extend to firing people based on who they are. And they've also given taxpayer-funded organizations that provide essential social services the power to turn away LGBTQ people seeking their services. And the list goes on. In addition to attacking LGBTQ Americans and their place of work and threatening their ability to have a safe place to live in, this administration has rolled back protection in schools. In 2019, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos refused to confirm whether or not her department supports policies that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But we don't need her to admit this. We know that this is happening and that she's failing LGBTQ youth. She did acknowledge, however, in her 2017 decision to roll back key Title IX interpretation that disproportionately affects transgender students. And it's true. It's a shame that the Secretary is hell-bent on rolling back protections for students who need it most. And as a former teacher, as I said, this is personal to me. I want to ensure that schools are welcoming for all students, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. All Americans, and especially children, deserve equal protection under the law. I also have the honor of serving as chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, and have witnessed how this president and his administration are disrespecting the service of brave Americans who step up to serve our country by instituting a trans military ban. Banning transgender people from serving is an affront to American ideals of fairness and justice, and it undermines our national security. This administration will go to extremes to make discriminatory policies the law of the land in the United States, but this won't happen on our watch. The Equality Caucus will not sit back as the Trump administration continues to dismantle crucial non-discrimination protections to the detriment of vulnerable members of the LGBT community. We have decades of experience in fighting back against these types of homophobic attacks, and while it is disheartening to still have to wage these battles in 2020, we have no plans to back down. We will fight this taxpayer-funded discrimination and continue to defend the LGBTQ Americans. And once more, I end with this thought: the appointment of one single LGBT person to a position of importance does not compensate for the systematic assault on the dignity of LGBTQ Americans. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Kelly.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney and Ranking Member Heiss, for holding this meeting today. I think that sometime, and I don't know when it'll happen, that we need to take a look at policy instead of politics. I just don't get the idea where we always got to go to the point where we're attacking each other all the time. You know, yesterday was the beginning of Lent. These 40 days, and the Lord says, return to me with your whole heart. That's the purpose of these 40 days that we practice, a lot of Christians practice, and I saw so many people yesterday with ashes on their forehead. Now, I don't know whether they were part of the lesbian, gay, trisexual, transgender, or queer people community. I don't know what they were. I know what they believe because they show it. And I think today's hearing is one of those things where you start to think about what is it that we're trying to do and what is this hearing about? And I would just submit to my friends on both sides of the aisle and across the country, this is about providing loving homes for children who are put in a position that they don't have a loving mother and father. And I would suggest that if we look at the very beginning of that, it all started in the faith-based community. It started with the religious people who said we have to find homes for these children. We have to have them grow up in a home where they are loved and they are cared for and they are nurtured. And I've met Mr. Maloney's husband, and they've done a great job raising their kids. I think that's wonderful. The part I'm here to talk about today is a piece of legislation, H.R. 897, the Child Welfare Provider Inclusion Act. The Child Welfare Provider Inclusion Act. And I want to really place the emphasis on Inclusion Act and not Exclusion Act. The purpose of the legislation is to promote inclusivity and diversity among child welfare service providers and prohibit government entities from discriminating against a child welfare service provider on the basis that that provider declines to provide a social service that conflicts with sincerely held religious beliefs or moral convictions of the provider. This is not an act that says anything about anybody else who is providing these services. It is not saying to exclude them, and I find it interesting that in a situation like this, where we are sitting today, that we have decided that unless you believe what I believe, you are not entitled to provide loving homes for little boys and little girls. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Mr. Maloney talked about discrimination. I was like, discrimination does not go one way. It seems to go both ways. If you do not believe what I believe, then you're discriminating against me. And so I'm on the other side of that issue and say, well, wait a minute. That's not what discrimination means. It means that we're open to all that. This bill, H.R. 897, excludes no one, no entity, no service, no agency from having access to federal funds, not to take care of a political issue, but to take care of homeless children that are looking for a loving home. If we're going to continue to tear apart what this country is based on, all because it doesn't fall within our agenda that day, then how far have we fallen as a country, and more importantly, as a nation? I've sat here for 9 years. This bill has been out there. All we need to do is get sponsors that say, you know what, we're with you. History tells us that it's all began in the faith-based community. They have deeply held religious beliefs. The LGBTQ community has deeply held beliefs. We do not discriminate against their beliefs. And we say, if that's what you choose, that is fine. All we ask is that you don't discriminate against the faith-based community because they don't hold those same beliefs. In America, we're going to decide who's morally right, who's wrong. It makes absolutely no sense that we are even having these debates and we're saying that unless you believe as we believe, you are not entitled to any funding. And what we're forgetting about is when we're going through this, with this opioid situation, how many children are waiting to go into a loving home? And are we really going to tell these agencies that provide foster care and adoptive care, you know what? You're not thinking the right way. Well, I tell you what, I think they are thinking the right way, and I think they are thinking with their hearts, and I think they are thinking that it's more important to take care of children who need a loving home than to have a debate. I have absolutely no problem with the LGBTQ community and what they believe. That's fine. All I ask is don't discriminate against somebody else who doesn't hold those same beliefs and that believes something different. If the issue is children, and it should be children, if the issue is providing loving homes, and it should be about providing loving homes, why would you tell the faith-based community you are not entitled to do that anymore? Even though you started it, and you're the ones that have provided it for so many years, we are now going to tell you, because you don't believe as we believe, you can do it. There's nothing in H.R. 897 that would ever take away anything from other agencies that think differently. And if we really are American, if we really do believe that everybody has a voice, and we really do believe that all are welcome, and we really do believe that our mission is to do the right thing for the right reasons, then I would just suggest it's time to really take a good, strong look at where we are today, and those things that divide us are so much farther away from what this country was founded on. We need to stop having this type of divisive talk and talk about inclusive talk, and I get where my friends are coming from, and I would just say, there's not one thing in H.R. 897 that would divide, that would take any funding away from other agencies that believe differently than what the religious and the faith-based community believes. So I thank you so much for inviting me here today. I would ask all my friends on both sides of the aisle to please take a look at H.R. 897, and let's really concentrate on what we need to concentrate on, and that's the children. If this is about children, let's make it about children. Let's not make it some type of a political divide instead of a strong policy that takes care of children that are so in need of loving homes. I thank you for having me, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Congressman Kennedy.
Madam Chair, thank you. I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Raskin and Ranking Member for convening this extremely important hearing today for your tireless efforts to expose this administration's dangerous assault on LGBTQ Americans. I want to acknowledge the testimony that we heard so far today from Mr. Kelly to my right, a man of deep faith, I think, somebody who genuinely believes in the best for our country, his constituents. I want to recognize Mr. Takano and Mr. Maloney's testimony and how grateful I am that they serve their country in the way that they do. I want to give a little bit of history here and then clarify a couple of points for the record. In 1993, Madam Chair, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act with overwhelmingly bipartisan support in response to Employment Division v. Smith, which saw 2 Native Americans fired from their jobs and denied unemployment after they consumed a drug outside of work as part of their religious faith. The intent of that law was simple: that Americans have a right to practice their faith freely and fully, that Native Americans had a human and legal right to practice their religion as they wished, that no Jewish child should be told they cannot wear a yarmulke at school, that no Sikh worshiper can be forced to reject the tenets of their faith to protect their communities or serve in our military. But the enforcement of RFRA has morphed into something far more dangerous, something that threatens the freedom of religion for each and every one of us. Because instead of shielding vulnerable Americans from persecution, this has now become a sword used to marginalize vulnerable communities. In our nation's history, few have wielded that sword more violently, more painfully than this president and this administration. Most recently with 9 proposed rules to open up our society to increased hate and violence. Let's be very clear about who has been left in that hateful wake. Students bullied by peers, faculty, and school leadership with nowhere else to turn. Pregnant teachers forced out of lifelong careers. Patients forced to suffer because of someone else's religious belief. Workers fired or forced onto an unemployment line for living their own lives. Homeless Americans denied shelter because this administration does not believe that they are worthy of housing. Children denied loving families. Prisoners denied human rights and basic dignity. Migrants and asylum seekers literally denied life. And unlike the claims of members of this administration's cabinet, these are not people seeking, quote, extra rights. These are Americans asking and begging to be treated the same as the next student at the desk, the next loving parents looking to adopt a child, the next employee to put on a uniform, and the next person seeking asylum or shelter. That is what the Do No Harm Act is about that I worked on and filed with Bobby Scott. It is a bill intended to restore RFRA to its original purpose and to clarify that no one can claim religious exemption from laws that protect against basic discrimination, govern wages and collective bargaining, prohibit child labor and abuse, provide access to health care, regulate public accommodations, or provide social services through government contracts. A bill to reestablish a lesson that Americans have learned painfully for generations, that if civil and legal rights exist only in the absence of a neighbor's religious objection, then they are not civil rights, but empty promises. The ability to freely and fully exercise sincerely held religious beliefs in this country is a liberty each of us cherishes. Across the nation, religious principle inspires countless families, organizations, communities to champion economic justice, human dignity, and common decency. But there is a difference between exercising religious beliefs and imposing them on others. Our Constitution fiercely protects the former and expressly prohibits the latter. If this administration cannot see the harm that they are causing not just to LGBTQ Americans and vulnerable communities, but to religious liberty itself, then Congress must act quickly and powerfully to open their eyes. Transgender Americans deserve better. LGBTQ plus Americans deserve better. Every single American deserves better. And let's get to the crux, if I may, briefly, about what we have heard today. This comes down to 2 big pieces. 1, a complete juxtaposition and a redefinition of who is a victim. We have learned across our society that the denial of services based on the central tenet of who the recipient of those services are constitutes discrimination. This idea, the formulation that you have heard from our colleagues, fundamentally flips that to say that the restaurant owner is being discriminated against, not the person denied services. It flips civil rights history on its head. That is the jujitsu that this Supreme Court and that a Republican majority seeks to sell on American public today. A redefinition of who, in fact, is a victim. And two, this is about state-sanctioned discrimination and state-sanctioned dollars. As Chairman Raskin pointed out, churches are free to do what they want with their own private dollars, their own philanthropy. But when it comes to your taxpayer dollars, my dollars, being used to tell somebody like Mr. Maloney that he is not a good enough parent because of who he is, then yes, I believe our government should say no. Because we believe in the ability of parents to be parents and children to deserve a home. And that's what this is about. Nothing more and nothing less. And lastly, let me just end on this. One of the proudest moments of my congressional career was marching in the Gay Pride Parade in Boston, Massachusetts in 2013. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Boston. As I walked down that street with my predecessor, Barney Frank, a former congressman, one of the first people to come out as gay in service to our country, and Jewish, and my former college roommate, a 7-foot-tall African-American professional basketball player who was the first person in a major professional sport to come out as gay. A gay Jewish former congressman, a pasty white, red-haired Irish Catholic, and a 7-foot-tall African-American professional basketball player walking down the streets of Boston with thousands of people cheering them on. Our founders may have been brilliant, but they never thought that that was going to happen. Our society has progressed to recognize the basic dignity of every single soul. That is what today is about. I yield back.
I thank my colleagues for their testimony before us today. Thank you very, very much. And our next panel should come forward. Thank you. I now would like to welcome our second panel of witnesses, and our first speaker will be Ernesto Livadas. Mr. Livadas entered the foster care system at 13 years old. He is currently a member of the Every Child Deserves a Family campaign. Secondly, we have Evan Minton. Mr. Minton is a public servant who was denied medical care for a gender transition-related hysterectomy at a religious hospital system. He is also a national advocate for LGBTQ rights. Thirdly, we have Sarah Warbolo. She is the legal director of the Human Rights Campaign. She is also an affiliated professor at George Washington University and George Mason Law School. And fourth, we have Hiram Sasser. Mr. Sasser is the Executive General Counsel of the First Liberty Institute. And lastly, we have the Reverend Sloan from New York. Thank you for being here. The Reverend Sloan is the Chief Executive Officer of the Family Equality and a trustee for the Union Theological Seminary. He has been an ordained Episcopal priest since 1991. And I would like to begin by swearing in the witnesses. If you would all please rise and raise your right hand. Where's that? Okay. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Let the record show that witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. The microphones are sensitive, so please speak directly into them without objection. Your written testimony will be part of the record. And with that, Mr. Livadas, you're now recognized to provide your testimony, and we'll go right down the list. Thank you all for coming.
Chairwoman Maloney, Congressman Heiss, Chairman Raskin, and Ranking Member Roy, thank you for permitting me to testify today on a topic of great personal importance to me. My name is Ernesto Livadas. I am from San Antonio, Texas. I spent 5 years in the Texas foster care system. I was only 13 years old when I went into the system. I was still trying to figure out who I was as a young man. My brother and I were placed in a shelter 180 miles away from my home city of San Antonio. I hated it. The staff was rude, and the other boys were mean. Youth and staff at my shelter used derogatory language. Words like faggot and homo made me feel uncomfortable, alone, and out of place. After leaving, I ended up at my only other placement, a group foster home with 11 other boys for the next 5 years. The foster care agency that I was placed through was a Christian agency. I believe my foster parents were good people with good intentions. They attended a Christian church. I am religious, but I am not a Christian. At first, I went with them to the Christian church out of curiosity, but as I got older, it became awkward and hurtful to hear that I would go to hell for being gay and that I wasn't normal. But if I didn't go, I might be made fun of or seen as weird and different. I was worried the other kids would think there was something wrong with me or suspect I was gay. So I never came out. Even though most people probably knew I was gay, when I saw people get bullied, it struck fear into me to be different. I wasn't wrong to fear coming out. LGBTQ+ and Two-Spirit youth are over twice as likely to report being treated poorly by the foster care system compared to non-LGBTQ youth. The thing that scared me the most is that I heard rumors that gay kids got sent to a special home, 24-hour surveillance with other youth who really had mental issues and special needs. If I came out and one of the other boys in the home didn't like it, would I be sent there? What about my brother? Would I lose being with him too? My sisters and I went to the same high school. Would I not see them again until I was 18? There was too much to lose. My brother and sisters mean the world to me, and the thought of being separated from them killed me inside. I'd do anything to keep those relationships close and safe to me. It is unethical and outrageous to separate any siblings for identifying as LGBTQ. I remember one day we were getting ready to go on a family vacation, and I went to grab my bag, the big bright blue one they give you to put all your things in when it's time to move placements. Someone had scratched out my name and written faggot in its place. I cried, and I kept it to myself until we got back from vacation. Eventually, I did tell my therapist what happened. I had asked her not to bring my foster parents into the room, and she decided to bring them in anyway. Even though I showed them the tag as proof, they denied that anyone in the house would ever do that, so nothing was ever done about that incident. I wonder if the agency serving me had been required to protect me from discrimination, regardless of religion, mine or the agency's, whether they would have been more proactive about preventing anti-gay bullying targeting me. It's not surprising to me that LGBTQ foster youth are more likely to become homeless. Many LGBTQ foster youth receive such poor treatment in foster care that they choose homelessness over foster care. South Texas isn't known for accepting kids or adults like me. The agency I was with wasn't either. I never met an LGBTQ foster parent or adoptive parent while I was in care. I only wish that I could have I wish I could have those opportunities to live and be who I was. The challenges I face should not be a part of a youth's experience in the child welfare system. That is why one day I want to be a foster dad, opened up my home, heart, so that kids like me, for kids like me. However, the discrimination that is happening in my state and other states around the country, I worry that I will be turned away, simply because I am gay. That's wrong. No foster child should be denied a loving family when a qualified person is willing to provide them a home. That's why I do support the bipartisan Every Child Deserves a Family Act, H.R. 3114, which would end discrimination based on religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity. This bipartisan bill, introduced by Chairman John Lewis, which currently has 180 co-sponsors, would also provide states like Texas with resources to provide better services for LGBTQ foster youth, so that children in care now wouldn't have to go through the same hard times I did. I urge the committee to support passage of H.R. 3114 and require the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to end discrimination in foster care programs and to provide affirming services to every LGBTQ child in foster care, regardless of religion of the agency serving that child. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Evan Minton.
Thank you, Congressman Maloney, Congressman Heiss, and members of the committee. I am honored to be here today. In August of 2016, I was in the process of undergoing a series of medical treatments stemming from my diagnosis of gender dysphoria. After my doctors determined that a hysterectomy was medically necessary, I was scheduled to undergo the surgery at Mercy San Juan Medical Center, a hospital in the Dignity Health chain, near Sacramento, California, where I live. I did not know much about Mercy San Juan Medical Center or Dignity Health, but I did know that my doctor regularly performs hysterectomies at that hospital. 2 days before the surgery date, a nurse called me to go over the details, and I mentioned that I was transgender. The very next day, a day before my surgery, the hospital called my surgeon to inform her that my surgery had been canceled. The reason? Because of my gender transition. When I heard the news, I remember being so devastated that I collapsed to the ground. I felt distraught and helpless that the hospital was refusing to treat me simply because of who I am. To make matters worse, the fact that the surgery was canceled then put all of the other medical procedures that I had scheduled in flux. Because I had already experienced delays in getting the care that I needed, the timing of this surgery was particularly important. I was fortunate in the fact that I was able to undergo a hysterectomy at a different hospital, but the experience leaves scars. I had no idea prior to seeking a hysterectomy that my local community hospital was a Catholic hospital, or that they would argue that religious doctrine permits them to deny medically necessary care just because the patients happen to be transgender. It should never, ever be okay to deny transgender people or anybody care just because of who they are. In 2017, the ACLU and the law firm Covington and Burling LLP filed a lawsuit against Dignity Health on my behalf. California law prohibits businesses that are open to the general public, including hospitals, from discriminating on the basis of gender identity. Just last fall, a California Court of Appeal agreed with me that I suffered discrimination when the hospital canceled my surgery. While my case has been pending in the courts, the Trump administration weighed in. In January 2018, less than a year after I filed my case, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services issued a proposed rule titled Protecting Statutory Conscience Rights in Healthcare. As opposed to working to protect patients and expand access to healthcare, the entire purpose of the refusal of care rule is to support religious people and entities in limiting the care they provide to patients. In the rule, 3 court cases were mentioned as a reason why the rule was necessary. Mine was one of them. The fact that the Trump administration singled me out my name is now in the Federal Register, truly knocked me down for almost a year. When I try to explain this to people, some folks feel that I should feel that this is a badge of honor or that I'm doing something right if the Trump administration is coming after me personally. I don't feel this way. I have felt like it is a heavy burden to carry, that it is emotionally draining, and that it's pressure-filled, and that it is completely overwhelming. And I still feel this way today, 2 years later. The Trump administration's refusal of care rule labels me as a threat. Their rule legitimizes what happened to me and encourages other hospitals to do the same. According to the Trump administration, I am not deserving of health care. According to the Trump administration, my life and the life of every single transgender American is disposable and just doesn't matter. So by inviting me here today, I am so grateful that I get to be more than just a name on a harmful document. I feel like I can finally reclaim my voice and attempt to take back my power, and I am so grateful for that. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Ms. Warbelow.
Chair Maloney, Congressman Heiss, and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. My name is Sarah Warbelow. I'm the legal director for the Human Rights Campaign, America's largest organization working to achieve full equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. It's an honor and a privilege to submit this testimony on behalf of our more than 3 million members and supporters nationwide. I'm here today before you, not only as a legal expert, but also as a bisexual woman who is the proud parent of a transgender girl. The right to believe and to worship or not are core American values. These constitutionally protected rights have shaped our nation and have cultivated the founder's dream of a pluralistic and free society. We are also a nation built on the values of equality, access to opportunity, inherent individual dignity, and a belief that each one of us must be allowed to shape our future free from the limiting stranglehold of bias. Since taking office, the Trump administration has consistently attacked our community's most vulnerable, employing a public policy strategy designed to divide and otherize, encouraging individuals and communities to see each other as enemies rather than neighbors. Despite these dangerous efforts to create a narrative of opposition, faith and civil rights communities are intertwined and continue to recognize our shared values and shared future. Under Trump's leadership, federal agencies have engaged in a dangerous effort to redesign the evidence-based approaches to our nation's administrative infrastructure. In the absence of legal or empirical support for these changes, agencies have instead relied on an oftentimes dramatically myopic and disingenuous legal interpretation. The Trump administration's regulatory agenda regarding religious exemptions has been predicated on a misrepresentation of 3 recent court decisions from the Supreme Court: Masterpiece Cake Shop, Trinity Lutheran, and Hobby Lobby. Numerous federal agencies, from HHS to HUD to DOL, have cited these cases as mandates to incorporate expansive religious exemptions into the Federal Register. They mischaracterize these decisions by ignoring the limiting language of the holdings and instead suggesting that they require the federal government to grant expansive exemptions to federal contractors and grantees. The Department of Labor engaged in this acrobatic legal analysis to support its revisions to the implementing regulations for Executive Order 11246, severely undermining the original mission of the executive order by stripping workers of basic protections and empowering federally funded businesses and organizations to discriminate against their employees with few safeguards. The thrust of these administrative actions has been to empower businesses and organizations to engage in discrimination without consideration for the impact on beneficiaries or workers. Every year, the federal government implements hundreds of social safety net programs designed to support and empower our nation's most vulnerable communities. The federal government accomplishes many of these programs through valuable partnerships with nonprofit organizations nationwide. The new Trump regulations not only turn a blind eye towards discrimination in social service programs, but have empowered and encouraged it. Looking to HHS as an example, we've seen this department erode patient and beneficiary protection since day one. This has been accomplished through numerous regulations, including revisions to the department's charitable choice and grant requirement regulations, and those implementing Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act and statutory conscience amendments. These changes undercut explicit beneficiary protections, empower discrimination and denial of service to our community in all HHS programs. Programs like homeless emergency services, child welfare programs, and substance abuse and mental health treatment. In some of these cases, these changes attempt to codify overly broad interpretations of RFRA. HUD has taken similar regulatory steps. The language provided by HUD to OMB proposing to revise the Equal Access Rule would empower providers to consider a range of factors in making housing determinations, including religious beliefs. As drafted, the HUD proposal would empower religious organizations operating HUD-funded programs, including emergency and homeless shelters, to turn away transgender people because of gender identity, or refuse to provide family services and housing to a same-sex couple because of its views on marriage. Similarly, the regulations adopted by HHS undermine the rights of young people struggling with homelessness and housing insecurity. Relying on flawed and unsupported legal reasoning, the White House has time and time again prioritized the rights of big organizations to discriminate against people who rely on the government for support and protection.
Thank you so much. Mr. Sasser.
Chairwoman Maloney, Congressman Heiss, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective on some important issues. My firm represents people of all faiths, from a Native American sweat lodge to the Falun Gong. And when the government tried to ban a development of an Islamic cemetery, we fought and won for the Muslim community. As President Clinton stated on November 16, 1993, as he signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, our founders cared a lot about religion, and one of the reasons they worked so hard to get the First Amendment into the Bill of Rights at the head of the class is that they well understood what could happen to this country, how both religion and government could be perverted if there were not some space created and some protection provided. We live in a pluralistic society with millions of Americans sharing differing views about family, faith, and conscience. In such a multicultural society, we must pursue tolerance and mutual respect. We can do this effectively without resorting to a zero-sum game of political power. Cooperation for mutual benefit is the goal. Coexistence with people of differing beliefs and backgrounds is the ideal. We must, as President Clinton urged us, explore how the First Amendment provides the space and protection we need for religious liberty to flourish in a pluralistic society. In United States v. Seeger in 1965, the Supreme Court had to interpret what Congress meant about the belief in a supreme being when Congress exempted conscientious objectors from compulsory military service. Taking a step back, it's quite remarkable that the state interest at stake is the very preservation of the state itself. But conscientious objectors have always received some form of protection since the Revolutionary War. Yet we as a nation, through our elected representatives in Congress, decided to exempt such objectors from compulsory service, even though doing so increased the possibility of another one among us bearing their burden, even the ultimate burden. And the Supreme Court in Seeger gave the fullest effect to that language, noting, quote, "It must be remembered that in resolving these exemption problems, one deals with the belief of different individuals who will articulate them in a multitude of ways. The validity of what he believes cannot be questioned. Local boards and courts are not free to reject beliefs because they consider them incomprehensible." Developments in the law of religious liberty bear mention and should serve as a guide for understanding the current administration's position regarding religious liberty protections. As Justice Brennan stated, concern for the autonomy of religious organizations demands that we avoid the entanglement and the chill on religious expression that a case-by-case determination would produce. As he further said, incorporation of presiding bishop versus Amos, I believe that a categorical exemption for such enterprises appropriately balances these competing concerns. Religious accommodation and exemption laws and their constitutional underpinnings have a long history in our country and a fully developed body of law. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is an excellent example for broad religious accommodation and an exemption in that it applies to all federal law. While RFRA is broad in its application, it does not guarantee any particular outcome. It only ensures that people whose religious beliefs have been burdened get their day in court. RFRA asks whether the rule or regulation is a substantial burden on religious activity of the person seeking an exemption from an otherwise neutral and generally applicable rule. If the court determines that the person seeking the exemption demonstrates that the rule or regulation causes a substantial burden on his or her religious exercise, the burden of proof switches to the government. Protecting minority faith positions is the key to liberty for us all, because we never know when we will be in the minority faith position. This is why we stood for the Muslim community when all they wanted was a plot of land on which to bury their loved ones. Indeed, there are circumstances when members of the Muslim faith, for example, must refrain from participating in something that conflicts with their faith that may be a very important part of someone else's life. The question arises as to which branch of government should be the guardians of religious liberty. From conscientious objectors to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, Congress has been the guardian of religious liberty. Thus, the executive branch should defer to Congress, and that role is what the current administration appears to embrace. Many of the administration's newer proposed regulations hew very closely to the relevant underlying statutes as set forth by Congress. In fact, much opposition to this administration's regulatory changes comes from the administration's refusal to deviate from its statutory authority, even when past administrations were willing to reinterpret Congress's decisions. The First Amendment remains a meaningful guardian should government stray from its constitutional obligations. As the Supreme Court said in West Virginia v. Barnett, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Sloan.
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Congressman Heiss, and Chairman Raskin. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm Father Stan Sloan. I'm an Episcopal priest, trustee for Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and the CEO of Family Equality. We're the national organization for LGBTQ people with children and for LGBTQ people who want to form families. I started my journey in the nonprofit sector by working for decades with the homeless in Chicago. The first part of that in Christian service for Episcopal charities, and the last 16 years focused on the disproportionately large population of LGBTQ homeless people as the CEO of Chicago House. Genesis 1:27 states that God created humanity in God's own image. Unfortunately, humanity has been returning that favor ever since, distorting God into whatever image many people may choose to form of God in order to justify their own comfortable lives or their own discriminatory practices. This distortion is at the very heart of our hearing today. Decades of working with the homeless taught me what 6 years of theological study could not. The Christian Gospels have a preferential option for the poor and for the marginalized. More, Christ, as seen in the Gospel narratives, prefers to spend his time and share his life with those same people, the poor and the marginalized, with the metaphor of overturning tables and of cleansing the tables for the temple for those who instead choose to distort religion for their own means. Many of us are here today to begin overturning tables and to begin cleansing our nation of distorted ideas of religion that have no place in the separation of church and state. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's. There are currently over 440,000 children in our child welfare system. Over a quarter of those children are able to be adopted at this moment, and yet 20,000 of those kids will graduate out of the system this year alone without finding parents. Last year, Family Equality made front page of USA Today with our research showing that 63% of LGBTQ millennials plan on forming families. That's a huge increase in the decades ahead. If you are LGBTQ in America, you are 7 times more likely to foster parent, and you're 7 times more likely to adopt a child than if you're straight. And yet 11 states now have laws that allow for legal discrimination against LGBTQ people in foster care and adoption. These laws have been put in place under the guise of religion and under the name of religious liberty. Congressman John Lewis's Every Child Deserves a Family Congressional Act, H.R. 3114, will overturn those bad laws nationwide. and those who care about children will support that act. There are those who will tell you that people who are denied a wedding cake at one bake shop can simply go to another bake shop. And for my husband and I, that's largely true. One of the advantages of being middle or upper class is the mobility that it affords. But my decades of working with the homeless in Chicago taught me that mobility is not a luxury that's afforded to those living in poverty. Being denied proper medical care as a trans person at the nearest clinic too often means being denied medical care entirely. Similarly, for those in LGBTQ and isolated by poverty or geography, being told no when seeking basic human needs, such as food or shelter, could mean being told no to survival itself. The abuse of Christian scripture and principles to justify prejudice is nothing new. The Book of Philemon was used by Christians to justify slavery during the Civil War, and again to justify discrimination in the 1960s. It's my belief that those supporting religious liberty have chosen religion as a parallel war of discrimination today. And yet, any objective reading of Scripture shows Christ himself as a man shunning zealots and embracing the marginalized. If instead we're respectful of church and state, and if we move this battlefield of discrimination from religion to our judicial, legislative, and executive systems, it becomes readily apparent that discrimination based on religion cannot stand if we are true to our founding principles. Regardless of the battlefield, it is time that we as a country begin overturning tables and cleansing our nation. For me as a middle-class American, this protection of civil rights is important. But for those that are poor and most marginalized, it is not only important, but necessary for life itself. Thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you so much for your testimony, and all of the panelists for your testimony. I recognize myself for questions. Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects students at publicly funded schools from discrimination based on sex. The scope of Title IX's protections has been a primary target of the Trump administration as it has rolled back protections for the LGBTQ community. In 2019, nearly 1 in 3 LGBTQ students were physically harassed. They were physically harassed based on their sexual orientation, while 1 in 4 were physically harassed based on their gender identity. Reverend Sloan, you have extensive experience working with LGBTQ youth. In your opinion, what message does the rollback of Title IX protection send to transgender students and other LGBTQ students who face discrimination based on their gender identities or sexual orientation?
So when our kids, when LGBTQ people are faced with this discrimination, it does emotional and lasting harm to them. Even if they are able to, as Mr. Minton did, find another place to receive the services or the benefits that they need. The mere rejection is a microaggression that scars us and that is very hard to heal from.
Thank you. Ms. Warbelow, President Trump's own Secretary of Education, Betsy Devos, initially resisted rolling back these Title IX protections, stating that she was uncomfortable because of the potential harm that rescinding them could cause to transgender students. Was Secretary DeVos right in her initial assessment regarding the impact of rescinding these protections, Ms. Warbelow?
Rescinding the guidelines to schools about their obligations to transgender students created a vacuum which encouraged schools to either engage in discrimination or, for most well-meaning administrators, created a lack of understanding of how they should move forward. They were frightened to protect transgender students despite the fact that they have an obligation not only under Title IX, but under the Equal Protection Clause as well. It's dangerous for students not to have the full protection of the government, Terrifyingly, the Department of Education is also failing to investigate claims of discrimination against LGBTQ students, particularly transgender students.
Well, can you give us some examples of some of the harms we've actually seen from the repeal of these protections?
Transgender students are expected to use restrooms that are not consistent with their gender identity. Students have been forced to use restrooms that are all the way across the campus from where their peers are using restrooms, singling them out for discriminatory behavior. Teachers refuse to intervene when trans students are being harassed by their peers and their classmates. And there are teachers who are disrespectful enough to refuse to call trans students by their names and appropriate pronouns.
In 2018, the Department of Education issued a troubling proposed rule that would undermine equal access to education for LGBTQ sexual assault survivors under Title IX. The rule would make it harder for survivors of sexual assault and harassment who disproportionately identify as LGBTQ to address their claims. How would rolling back these protections harm LGBTQ youth, Ms. Warbelow?
Nearly half of bisexual women have experienced sexual assault, as have nearly half of transgender people in their lifetime. The Title IX rule on sexual assault makes schools more dangerous for all, especially LGBTQ students. There's many provisions of the rule that would harm students, but there are some that are particularly dangerous for LGBTQ students. First, allowing religious institutions to discriminate against LGBT students without warning places them in a situation where they are unaware of whether or not their school will support them if they experience sexual assault or violence. The narrow definition of harassment, from unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature to only incidents that are so severe and pervasive to be objectively effective, denies all students equal access to education.
Well, earlier this month, I led every committee Democrat in sending a letter to Secretary Devos asking for documents related to this proposal and who is behind it. So far, we have not gotten the documents we asked for, but we will continue our oversight of Title IX, this rule, and Secretary DeVos's troubling record at the Department of Education. Every young person deserves the right to an educational environment in which they are respected and protected. Instead, the actions of this administration have created an environment where LGBTQ youth are made to feel unprotected, unsupported, and unseen. I would now recognize
Madam Chairwoman.
I will now recognize the gentlewoman from West Virginia.
Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to enter something into the record.
Without objection.
So I'd like to enter into the record, among many others to come, a letter from His Excellency George Murray, Bishop of Youngstown and Chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee for Religious Liberty, expressing his disappointment with the framing of this hearing, specifically its title, asserting that religious liberty is an assault. And while we may disagree on specific applications of religious liberty claims or the impact of these regulations in particular, I'd like to enter in this letter as well as others from other organizations.
Objection, so ordered.
Without?
And I now recognize, you may submit it.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
And I now recognize Ms. Miller from West Virginia, and she will be followed by Jamie Raskin. And I am asking Jamie to now chair this committee. I've been called to a markup in another committee. I thank everyone for being here on this important issue.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, and thank you all for being here today to discuss this important topic. I do want to say from the beginning that I'm commending the Trump administration's strong commitment for advancing rights for all people, and particularly the commitment to eradicating AIDS epidemic worldwide. And I'm encouraged by the work that the administration is doing to treat all people with dignity and respect that they deserve. I think it's very important that we understand that. Freedom of religion is one of the foundational tenets of our country. Additionally, liberty and freedom from a burdensome government is a right afforded to every American. I believe in equality for everyone in the eye of law, and this discussion is an opportunity to find the balance that we strive to work towards. There are many views surrounding the topic of equality and religious freedom today, and I hope that we can all have a productive discussion that will ensure the rights for all people and that all people are protected. Mr. Sasser, do you believe that the regulations proposed by the Trump administration seek to maximize individual liberty?
I think that the Trump administration is trying to focus on its duty as the executive branch to conform its regulations to Congress's decisions that they've made through legislation. Many of the regulatory changes that have been proposed or enacted were simply to try to bring the language back into conformance with statutes that this body had already previously passed. I'll give you an example. Since Title IX was raised, there was an issue in the previous administration with religious schools having to seek exemptions and having difficulty receiving their exemptions from Title IX because Congress said that religious schools shall be exempt. And in matter of fact, Congress was very specific. It was granting an exemption without having to go through all the jumps and hoops and everything else that the previous administration had enacted. And I think what this administration is trying to do is to conform its definitions and conform its regulations to the statutes that this body has passed. Congress, Article I, branch of government, is the guardian of liberty. These are the representatives of the people of the United States from all parts of the United States and all different types of backgrounds. Obviously, there's going to be a difference between Waxahachie, Texas, and New York City. This is the place where those negotiations take place and that language is crafted. And it's not perfect. It's not what everybody wants. Somebody has to give a little bit here and there, as we all understand. That's part of that negotiation process. And I think that it does a disservice to ask the executive branch to try to go beyond the language that this body has negotiated.
Thank you. Can you explain the background behind your organization's support for eliminating unfair barriers for faith-based organizations?
Well, we represent people of all faiths, and in particular, anytime a particular viewpoint, religious viewpoint, is in the minority from the mainstream ideas of what is orthodox and what the mainstream, I think, is the right thing to do, there's going to be a lot of pressure on them, both social pressure and then political pressure and then ultimately legal pressure to change their mind, to conform their religious beliefs to what the larger public would like them to have. And I think it's the work of the First Amendment to protect those minority positions, and that's what we focus on. We focus on battling against government overreach into religious affairs, because we believe that what the promise that Thomas Jefferson made to the Danbury Baptists is true, which is that the government should not be interfering with religious entities and their beliefs.
I have one other quick question. How can we strive to make sure that the LGBTQ rights and the religious freedoms rights coexist?
The best way to do that is through the proper negotiation and congressional process that we have here, instead of asking the executive branch to do it by fiat, which is this particular administration doesn't appear to want to do.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, is now recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. I particularly appreciate this hearing because my own district, the District of Columbia, is regularly targeted by the minority for its laws regarding the LGBTQ community. An example is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which, as you know, is used to overturn has been used to overturn laws that protect the LGBTQ community, but it was declared unconstitutional as applied to the states, but not the federal government and the District of Columbia, which is another reason that the passage of our statehood bill this year is so important. RFRA has been used as a justification even recently. Senator Ted Cruz, here in the House, Representative Vicky Hartzler, for attacks on the district's Human Rights Amendment. And that was an amendment which I was able to get that rider, as they are called, taken off. But that was an amendment, a law in the District of Columbia that said that you couldn't deny that universities, public schools, private schools, both could not deny the use of their facilities, their school facilities. An example of that would be your facility to holding a meeting. Initially, Georgetown University, very distinguished Catholic university, perhaps the most distinguished, were in favor of that denial, but Georgetown has overturned its own views on that and now allows LGBTQ students to organize on their campus and to have use of their facilities to hold meetings. We're seeing a repeat here by some on the other side of what we've just gone through with respect to the census. In the census, you'll remember, we were enshrining ignorance of who was in the country. So we didn't want to count non-citizens, even though the Constitution says all persons shall be counted. So what we've seen with this administration is they don't want to count LGBTQ people either. And so while initially, I guess from the census as left to them by the Obama administration, they included sexual orientation in the 2020 census. But then they quickly came back and said, oh, that's a mistake. We don't want to know anything. We don't want to count the LGBTQ community. So just as with whoever is in the country, they don't want to know, so they don't want to know anything about the LGBTQ communities, right? They don't exist as far as this administration is concerned. So I'd like to ask all of you to discuss how you think, why you think the federal government could better serve the LGBTQ community or not. If they knew more about the size of that community, the demographics, the needs of that community, why do you think the federal government, could the federal government better serve, or is it simply irrelevant to the federal government who LGBT community people are in our jurisdiction? And if I could get everyone to respond to that in our country, everybody should respond to that question. Do we need to know? And if so, why do we need to know?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I believe that the federal government should step in and help end discrimination. I can't talk about a lot of the laws and a lot of the government things, but I can talk about my personal experience and how the government could have helped me. It could have helped support my foster parents first and foremost with services on how to speak, how to handle, how to take care of a gay young man in their home, and how they could have cut down the bullying, cut down the derogatory terms that were used.
If we had had information on what this, I want to get everybody to answer. So if we'd had that information, then maybe action could have been taken of the kind you have lived through. Mr. Minton?
Yes, I certainly believe that the federal government needs to count LGBTQ people in the census, and I believe that they need to do that for a number of reasons. The LGBTQ population is greatly underserved, and if we know how many of us are truly out there, then I think that that would lead to the services that we need. For example, 40% of the transgender community has attempted suicide. We need culturally competent care when the transgender community is subject to medical denial due to anti-transgender bias. That number jumps to 60% attempted suicide rate. We need medical providers out there. We need all sorts of services, but we're never going to know how much we need unless we're truly counted. So I thank you for all of the work that you've done, and I urge all of us to continue in these efforts. And I think if the federal government were to sit down with us, I fear that they're hostile to our community, and by their actions they've shown that. But if they were to sit down with us, then perhaps they could have a sense of compassion and see that that we are people, and that we do count, and that we should count.
Okay. The gentlelady's time has expired. Now we're going to go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, and he's recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to take a moment to reset some context for today's hearing. Freedom from government coercion is a right afforded to every American, no matter their sexual orientation or gender preference. The Trump administration's regulations do not deny LGBTQ individuals their fundamental civil rights. What the administration is doing, as they should, is revisiting the balance between religious conscience and LGBT rights, because many Americans had concerns with how this balance swung way out of proportion during the Obama administration. LGBT Americans should and do have absolute freedom from discrimination, just as all Americans should have the absolute freedom from mandated acceptance of an ideology. So with that in mind, I really want to shed some positive light here on the vital role that faith-based organizations play in my communities, in the 1st Congressional District of Kentucky, and in many communities throughout the United States. There is a spectacular organization in my district called New Pathways for Children. They are a faith-based organization running 2 group homes with licensed counselors and any resources that children would ever need. They care for children who suffered maltreatment from neglect, abandonment, or abuse. They serve children who experience poverty, homelessness, incarceration of a parent, or parents who enter drug or alcohol rehab. And yes, children are encouraged to explore faith and given regular opportunities for personal spiritual growth through biblical study, worship, retreats, camps, and mission trips. So today, I really do take offense to framing religious organizations like these as the enemy, when in fact they are doing some of the best work to help aid children in need. To that end, Mr. Sasser, I have a couple of questions with respect to foster care. Can you elaborate on the diverse backgrounds and needs of the hundreds of thousands of children in foster care, briefly?
Well, the foster care industry is served by a wide variety of different types of agencies, some of which are motivated by their religious beliefs, some are secular, some are religious, but have different beliefs about how families should be structured and that sort of thing. And one of the best things about our system is that we have a lot of freedom and a lot of choice. And not every family is going to be the same. And I think that it's important to have different agencies that are recruiting parents from different types of backgrounds. Because I think it's important. If you have an Orthodox Jewish child who suddenly is in the foster care system, I think that it's important that there be an Orthodox Jewish foster care agency that can help recruit and find a home for that person. I don't know how else you would properly serve them in that way.
And I agree. These children need a diversity of individuals working on their behalf to provide them a loving home. Mr. Sasser, why would anyone want to close a loving, supportive, well-run foster home? And why would anyone want to close off such an avenue to help these children in need?
Well, I don't know. I think President Clinton actually said it best. He said, "But let us never believe that the freedom of religion imposes on any of us some responsibility to run from our convictions. Let us instead respect one another's faiths, fight to the death to preserve the right of every American to practice whatever convictions he or she has, but bring our values back to the table of American discourse to heal our troubled land." And I don't think anyone could say it better than that.
My last question, and you can educate me on this. Did Pennsylvania close a foster home run by a parent of the year? Are you familiar with that situation?
I am not familiar with that specific situation. I apologize.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the hearing, and I hope that my statement isn't meant to offend anyone, but people in the faith-based community provide so many valuable services to people in need, and it's just unfortunate that they're constantly under attack by many members of this committee, and I hope that in my brief 5 minutes I can shed some light as to some of the good things they're doing, and hopefully we don't create any more unintended consequences for these faith-based organizations that are providing an invaluable service to children and women all across America. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruda, is recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is one undeniable fact, and that is discrimination, period, regardless of how it occurs. And with the testimony we've heard today, I feel like I'm on the Republican absurdity train as we hear some of these arguments. And I want to be clear here. Federal law does not expressly prohibit discrimination against the LGBTQ community. And Ms. Warblow, I'm going to direct my questions towards you. Is that a correct statement, what I just said?
There are very few places in federal law where there are express protections for LGBTQ people. And right now, the Supreme Court is contemplating whether or not to strip away rights from the LGBTQ community under Title VII and potentially other laws as well. We need express protections to guarantee non-discrimination.
So let's walk through these religious exemptions as we take a trip on this absurdity train. We talked a little bit earlier about the idea in a court case that supported the notion that an employer can withhold birth control and condoms to people that work for them because it's against their religious beliefs. Is that correct?
That's correct. Hobby Lobby.
Okay. There are religions who believe that no medical care should be provided whatsoever to them or their children. So if we take this absurdity train a little bit further down the road, is it possible that in the belief of religious exemptions that you would then not have to provide any health care to your employees if that was your religion?
Ignoring the confines of Hobby Lobby, this administration has put forward the idea that doctors and other medical care providers should be able to refuse to perform any type of medical service that conflicts with their beliefs.
So going back to the situation that Mr. Minton experienced firsthand, if a hospital was religious-based that did not believe in addressing the medical needs of the LGBTQ community under the Trump administration and the absurdity of the Republican argument that they are making, all healthcare services could be denied by that hospital, and it's not a problem because Mr. Minton can just go somewhere else. Is that the argument?
That's the intention of this administration, as they've made clear through their regulations.
So let's go a step further down the path here, because there are many protected classes that include race and color. So if those classes were not directly protected under U.S. law, and somebody had a faith-based reason to discriminate against them, under the Trump administration and the Republicans who support it, they too could be discriminated against. Is that correct?
So the Trump administration in their filings has drawn a hard line at race in most circumstances, but they've made clear that individuals with disabilities, women, people of minority faiths, and the LGBTQ community should be subject to a different set of standards standards, allowing for widespread discrimination, including in the healthcare space.
So it's okay to discriminate against some people, just not all people, depending on their specific circumstances, and whether those circumstances are specifically protected under United States law. I guess my question is, if there were other communities that were not specifically covered under U.S. law, is it possible that Republicans would also seek religious exemptions that would allow discrimination against those communities?
It's certainly possible. What I'm hearing is an expectation that everything be codified in statute before someone be provided protections. That is not the history of our country. Agencies have long adopted regulations that provide protections for beneficiaries on a number of bases, and the idea that they would no longer have the freedom to do so is quite troubling.
Mr. Minton, if I could move to you, I would like you to expand a little bit more on your personal experience of having health care denied to you, if you would take a few moments.
Yeah. Well, my personal experiences having healthcare denied to me did not end with my original hysterectomy. It's continued. Shortly after my phalloplasty surgery, I had an issue with my catheter not staying in place, and I went to the urgent care, and they couldn't take care of me because they couldn't take care of that issue, and they sent me to an emergency room. Unfortunately, the emergency room was in the same parking lot and it was a Dignity Health hospital. I refused to go to the emergency room that was a Dignity Health hospital because they refused to recognize that I exist as a transgender person. And instead, I went into a public restroom and I called my surgeon and asked that they give me the directions over the phone. And while they were giving me the directions, I performed the operation on myself. Not only that, but more recently, a pharmacy made a mistake, and instead of giving me 5 pills of 25 milligrams each, they gave me 5 pills of 125 milligrams each. I was staying at my parents' house, and they discovered me barely able to speak and unable to walk. The nearest emergency room was Mercy San Juan Medical Center, which, as I said earlier in my testimony, was a Dignity Health chain. I needed to go to the emergency room, and instead of in my drug stupor and even in my inability to talk, I was able to make out the sound, "No, not that." And they took me to emergency room farther away. And just to relay the seriousness of this, when I got to that emergency room, they treated me as a stroke victim for a number of hours. So it's not only me that is avoiding these hospitals. I talk to friends and family who are both LGBTQ+ and not, and they won't go to these hospitals either. It's important to mention that 1 in 6 hospitals in California are Catholic beds. We can't go to these hospitals. And when it's in rural areas, it's even worse. It's the only hospital around. This is a matter of life and death.
Thank you, Mr. Minton, and thank you for your compelling testimony and showing the absurdity of the situation we're addressing. I yield back. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, is now recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would begin by saying upholding the First Amendment is not an absurdity train, and protecting the religious liberties of the people of this great country is not in any way absurd. Mr. Sasser, let me go to you quickly. On the issue of beliefs, the beliefs that people have, just in general, is it fair to say that beliefs impact people's behavior?
Well, beliefs drive and serve as the motivation for people, especially for charitable organizations. I mean, for example,
Well, just generally speaking, it's fair to say that beliefs do impact behavior.
Well, sure. I mean,
all right, so let's take it a step further. Deeply held religious beliefs. Do those deeply held beliefs impact the way people live?
Of course they do.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that as it relates to religious beliefs, just within that context, would it be fair to say that people with those deeply held religious beliefs literally practice what they believe? Everything else is just religious talk. But if it's a deeply held religious belief, they actually practice that.
Well, sure they do.
Okay. So is it also fair to say that when we're talking about religious liberty in America and the protections that we have under the First Amendment, that those are not just an issue of where I worship or how I worship?
Oh, it's part of their everyday life.
It's part of their everyday life. So an individual's deeply held religious beliefs go far beyond the walls of a church or synagogue or a building of faith. Those deeply held religious beliefs actually, literally, daily impact issues related to how that person works, play, their recreation, their politics, their family life, and their obviously their worship life. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. It's their entire life.
Okay, so with that, would you consider any attempts from government or otherwise that would prevent or disable people who hold deeply held religious beliefs from practicing those beliefs to be problematic?
Well, not only, I don't think that it's just that thinks it's problematic. Our founders thought it was problematic, and that's why they put in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution in order to protect religious liberty. And that's why this body passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993 when they felt that the Supreme Court was not honoring the original meaning and understanding of the First Amendment.
So what you do on a daily basis is help defend people of faith who are increasingly in this country experiencing hostility, an environment, and we see it. I've dealt with this myself for 20 years plus, seeing an increase of hostility towards people of faith on multiple fronts. Would you consider it in and of itself discriminatory towards people of faith for government or other entities to come in and try to force those people with deeply held religious convictions to forsake those convictions or close the doors of their business or whatever it is that they're involved with?
Well, not only is it unconstitutional religious viewpoint discrimination, but I mean, there's entire bodies of law that support that.
So you would say that that is in and of itself discriminatory?
Well, sure it is.
All right. Your organization has called religious freedom the foundational right that all others are built upon. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, sure. The worst competition for a totalitarian form of government is for its people to believe in a power that's greater than government, and for people to have an allegiance to something that is greater than the government. I remember teaching at a law school, a seminar in Romania. It wasn't too long after the fall of communism there, but it had been some years. And the students found it quite remarkable that I would suggest that rights pre-exist government, and that there are certain foundational rights that are embedded not only in the Constitution, but are endowed by our Creator, as our Declaration of Independence acknowledges. And those rights pre-exist government, and any attempt of the government to impact those rights must be met with heavy resistance.
I thank you, and I thank the chairman, and we've got to understand discrimination goes both ways, and deeply held religious beliefs impact the way people daily live, and any attempt to eradicate that is in itself discriminatory. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And Mr. Heiss, thank you for that illuminating exchange. And I want to pick up on that with my own 5 minutes of questioning, because the moment that we're at right now in terms of trying to clarify the relationship between the non-discrimination norm under equal protection for all citizens and religious liberty is a moment that we've arrived at other times in our history. And so I'd like to go back to the 1960s when the first civil rights laws were created to try to include African Americans who'd been the victims of Jim Crow discrimination. So I'm thinking of Supreme Court decisions like Heart of Atlanta Motel, the Ollie's Barbecue case, and other public accommodations decisions where restaurant owners, lunch counter owners, department store owners made precisely this same First Amendment claim, invoking either religious freedom or the freedom of association. And they said that if you're making me serve black customers or interracial parties, you're violating my religious freedom because we believe that this is fundamentally offensive to our religious system. So we don't want to use our restaurant or department store or hotel or motel or lunch counter in this way. And yet that was overridden by the Supreme Court, saying if you're a place of public accommodation and you're dealing with civil rights law, you have to comply with the law just like everyone else does. And so isn't that illuminating in terms of this debate that we're having today? Ms. Warbelow, let me ask you.
Absolutely. The Supreme Court recognized, as it has over and over again, that there are limitations to our fundamental rights when those fundamental rights end up impeding upon the rights of others. It's one of the reasons that the Supreme Court so critically in Piggy Park made clear that despite the owner's sincerely held religious beliefs about separation of the races, he was still obligated to serve African Americans.
Okay, so those views are sincerely held by racist restaurant owners or racist amusement park owners or racist theater owners, and yet the courts repeatedly found throughout the 20th century that those views could not overcome the fundamental public accommodation, equal protection rights of the people, right? That's because they're in the stream of commerce in a public accommodation. Now, of course, any person who disfavors interfaith marriages or same-sex marriages or interracial marriages doesn't have to invite people over to their house for dinner if they don't want to. They don't have to be friends with them. But if you enter the stream of commerce and you set up a restaurant or you set up a hotel or motel, you're subject to all of the public accommodations laws, aren't you?
That is correct.
And that's true for hospitals as well, isn't it?
For those places that define hospitals to be places of public accommodation.
And it is true for the provision of federal governmental services, isn't it? Isn't that's really what this discussion is about, whether the equal protection norm, the anti-discrimination norm, should apply when we're talking about the distribution of federal tax dollars that come from all citizens, right?
This is about protecting the most vulnerable among us.
So the argument about whether or not it's the rights of the person who wants the services of a hospital, or it's the right of the hospital to deny service, that is a problem that we've seen before, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And, I mean, is there any reason to think that, that America would be better off if we turn the clock back to a time when it was okay for the providers of services, whether it's a hotel, a motel, a restaurant, a hospital, an adoption agency, to discriminate against the people who are served?
Not only is this dangerous for LGBTQ people, it's also dangerous for people of faith. There are many disfavored religious minorities within this country, and it's terrifying to think that we would undermine our longstanding civil rights laws to allow for discrimination against people of faith as they operate through daily life. That's why those non-discrimination laws that apply equally to all protected characteristics exist.
All right. I think Mr. Heiss began by stating something which I found very optimistic and promising. He said, the notion that the Trump administration is somehow attacking the LGBT community is wrong. The United States continues to be a world leader in guaranteeing the civil rights of all, including the LGBT community. Under President Trump, the federal government has sought to treat all Americans, gay or straight, religious or non-religious, fairly and justly. I would like that to be true. Is that true? Reverend Sloan, let me come to you.
No, that's not true.
Well, can you just explain why?
We've seen our rights continue to be eroded under this administration. It takes different forms, but relative to religious liberty, you know, I'm one of those rare clergy. I don't like to talk in front of people. I get nervous, and I'm not a lawyer, but have always believed, and I've always been taught, that your right to swing your fist stops at somebody else's nose. And what we've seen under this administration is that that we're hitting, and it's hurting people, and in particular, it's hurting people who are isolated geographically, and it's hurting people who are isolated by poverty.
Okay, and I'll just close with the thought that if you read James Madison's beautiful memorial and remonstrance against religious taxation in Virginia, the argument he made was that we want so much religious liberty in America that the government would not interfere in anybody's worship, anybody's relationship between himself or herself and God. That's what the heart of religious liberty is. And to transmogrify it into the right to discriminate against other people in the provision of essential services strikes me as a deformation not only of equal protection, but of religious freedom as well. And with that, I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank the Chair. I'd like to start with a couple of quick questions. Mr. Sasser, I've only got 5 minutes, so let's try to move through a couple of them quickly. But on this point that my friend from Maryland there has raised, my recollection, right, was that the Civil Rights Act, for example, was very careful in the way Congress talked about it in terms of, or structured it, I should say, not talked about it, in terms of enumerating the businesses it would cover, right? Inns, motels, restaurants, places that serve food and so forth in the stream of commerce. Can you talk a little bit about what the gentleman from Maryland just talked about in the context of our current conversation with respect to public accommodation and then protecting religious liberty, for example, for cake bakers or florists and others where these issues arise?
Well, sure. Well, actually, the Congress led the way in the late 19th century in passing the Civil Rights Act. It was the Supreme Court that overturned it, and I believe erroneously, which set back civil rights many, many decades. But to the point with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it obviously has a very, it's long, but it's a limited list of various institutions that are covered by that. But one of the things that that's gone further is some states have passed various accommodation laws that have gone further than what Congress has passed, and those states are subject to the Constitution. And for example, for the cake bakers like Masterpiece Cakes, the state of Colorado overstepped its bounds, its constitutional bounds, in enforcing its accommodation laws against Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cakes. And the Supreme Court ruled that in a 5-4 decision that was a violation of the Free Exercise Clause.
Thank you for that, and I think that's an important point for us to be contemplating as we're talking about this. And, you know, I understand my friend from Maryland is talking about the balance there and where the line, you know, to use the analogy that where somebody's fist stops at somebody's nose. But I think this is really important, right? Because we've got individuals who, according to their religious faith, find it objectionable to bake a cake, deliver flowers, whatever, and we want to make sure we're protecting religious liberty and ensuring that that's covered. Let me switch gears for just a quick second here. Mr. Sasser, I think you're probably aware of Mr. Russ Vought, who's the director of the Office of Management Budget, and he had a rather contentious hearing over in the Senate. And there's a notable senator who may or may not be engaged in the current Democratic presidential nominations process, who berated Mr. Vought for comments he made about his views on his Christian faith. He had he's an alumnus of Wheaton College, and he'd expressed in his private capacity prior to being nominated his beliefs in his Christian faith and expressed those publicly. And yet Mr. Sanders sought to block his nomination, and importantly, I think put forth a religious test, essentially. And he said that Mr. Vought is, quote, really not someone who this country is supposed to be about. To your limited knowledge of those facts, can you comment about whether religious tests are appropriate and whether Mr. Sanders is appropriate in that attack?
Well, the Constitution, the original Constitution, not just in the Bill of Rights, the original Constitution prohibited religious tests for public office very specifically, because we're not going to discriminate against people because of their faith or if they don't happen to share the faith of someone else or certain beliefs. Like Reverend Sloan and I, we may have different religious beliefs, and we should not exclude each other, obviously, from public service.
I appreciate that. I agree. you and I have worked together before. I'm proud of you being a Texan and what you do in protecting First Amendment rights and religious liberty. We worked together, as I recall, in a hearing, gosh, probably 14 or 15 years ago when I was in the Constitution Subcommittee with John Cornyn on religious liberty. And we brought forward a host of examples of religious persecution across all faiths. If I recall correctly, we had a young lady who was quite delightful that we brought in from Oklahoma who was persecuted basically for wearing her hijab. And she came in and was a witness in our hearing, and we made sure to highlight religious persecution in all respects across the nation. I was wondering if you might, for the benefit of the committee, and I'll turn it over and then yield back my time, but just ask you a question. Can you provide some real-life examples of individual religious liberty being infringed upon at the expense of another and others? And can you just go through some of the examples you guys have dealt with at First Liberty?
Well, sure. I'm one of the nearest and dearest to our heart, and one that we're working on very much so are the Jewish synagogues that are just north of New York City, and just in the neighboring town of Airmont, New York, just neighboring Monsey, where they had the machete attack in one of the house synagogues there. Those communities are extremely hostile to the Orthodox Jewish community. And if you would see some of their campaign ads and some of the other things that they do, it's despicable that this is what's going on in this nation, and it's a difficult fight, and it's a fight that the Department of Justice has been waging in that area for almost 20 years, and we still have not been able to eradicate the anti-Orthodox Jewish community discrimination that is going on in that community. The religious discrimination is alive and well in this nation, and it takes vigilance to fight it.
All right, the gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Roy. Now the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, is recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think that we're all talking about the coronavirus right now as a huge contagion. I think that discrimination is a contagious disease. And I think that the more that the Trump administration justifies discrimination, I think the more that discrimination spreads and it hurts a lot of people. On May 4th, 2017, in the White House Rose Garden, President Trump called the United States a, quote, nation of faith and a, quote, nation of tolerance. But I'm concerned that his words that day did not reflect his actions. On that day, President Trump signed an executive order supposedly promoting free speech and religious liberty. Ms. Warbelow, before this executive order was signed, LGBTQ plus activists expressed concerns that it could lead to discriminatory policies across the federal government. Isn't that right?
A leaked version of the original executive order outlined myriad ways in which the Trump administration intended to discriminate against LGBTQ people. And when the final executive order was signed, it directed the Department of Justice to go agency by agency to implement unfounded interpretations of Supreme Court case law privileging religious viewpoints over the rights of LGBTQ people, women, people with disabilities, and importantly, people of minority faiths.
Can you give us a couple examples of that?
So, one of the things that we've been talking about is discrimination on the basis of religion by religiously affiliated adoption and foster care agencies. The Department of Health and Human Services gave a waiver to the state of South Carolina to allow for discrimination by an agency that is a conservative Christian agency that has discriminated not only against LGBTQ people, but the waiver was specifically given to allow that agency to discriminate against Jewish people and against Catholic people. And this is an agency that receives 90% of the funding available to provide foster and adoption care within the state.
Well, this is deeply concerning. As a member of a racial, religious, and ethnic minority, I am deeply concerned when anybody's allowed to discriminate on the basis of what you said is happening. Mr. Sasser, my name is Raja Krishnamurthy. In a prior hearing, I was called Roger Christian Murphy. And in fact, the other day, HuffPost called me Ro Khanna, and Ro Khanna was called Raja Krishnamurthy. I prefer to go by Raja Krishnamurthy. You can call me Raja, or you can call me Mr. Krishnamurthy. I presume you are Mr. Sasser, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I presume that you'd like me to call you Mr. Sasser, not Ms. Sasser, is that right?
Whatever floats your boat.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think it's an attack on religious liberty to refer to someone by the pronouns they prefer if that person happens to be transgender?
Well, I know that just in my personal practice, if somebody wanted me to call them something, I would call them that. I think most people are that way. I think that there may be some religious institutions that have institutional reasons why they want to make sure that they adhere to their faith in some way that requires them to be very specific. And I think there's room for that in our country, too. I think that we have a...
Hold on, let me stop you there. You think there's room in our country for a religious organization or a religious figure to refer to someone by a pronoun or gender that's not consistent with the pronoun or gender that they prefer?
Well, if the alternative is that the government is going to, by force, make somebody use speech that they find religiously objectionable, and that the government by force will make them do that, I don't think that there's room for a totalitarian move to have government
I'm sorry, you
force.
think that calling someone by a certain pronoun that they prefer would be a totalitarian
that's not
move
what I
on
said
our
at
part?
all.
That's
not
exactly what you said.
No, it's not what I said at all.
That's exactly what you just said.
I said that I would call somebody whatever they wanted, and I think most decent people would. But I also do believe that to have the government show up and
Is that an
try to
attack
force
on your
somebody-
religious liberty to ask you to refer to someone by the pronoun they prefer?
Well, the alternative is that we have the government forcing people to engage in speech with which they have a religious objection. I don't know if everyone wants to go down that road. If the government can force someone to say something that they have a disagreement with, a deep religious disagreement with, forced speech. I mean, the United States Supreme Court dealt with that in West Virginia versus Barnett in 1943 during the height of World War II, when everybody was trying to be as patriotic as possible, and West Virginia wanted to make little third graders stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance. What's more American than that? But they had a religious objection to that forced speech, and the United States Supreme Court in 1943 said, we're not going to force people to speak against their religious beliefs.
You compare calling someone by a gender pronoun that they believe to be inconsistent with their identity, similar to forcing someone to engage in political speech that they disagree with. Is that what you're maintaining today? That's political speech.
What I'm saying is that it's free speech, and it was enforced by the United States Supreme Court.
Free speech is calling people all kinds of slurs, but that's something that we prohibit. Discrimination is something that we prohibit, and it's prohibited by the law. I would respectfully submit that you should also subscribe to that principle. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is now recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Sure. How long have you been dealing in this area of law, Mr. Sasser?
I've been practicing this area of the law for almost 18 years.
Okay. Have you seen any change over time in the attitude of our society? I mean, obviously we have freedom of religion in this country. We're not supposed to favor one over the other. But I think largely this hearing is about whether we're able to impose one's either non-religion or type of religion over somebody else's religion. And have you seen an increase of intolerance towards what I'll call traditional religions in the last 18 years in this country?
Well, I think that we've always struggled as a nation with religious liberty, trying to make sure that we strike the appropriate balances. We haven't always done it perfectly. There's been lots of cases at the Supreme Court over the years. The Jehovah's Witnesses had to fight. The Amish had to fight. There's been lots of different battles that have gone on. What I think is going on now is that for whatever reason, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed in the Senate 97-0, and it was a voice vote in the House of Representatives. It was sponsored by Senator Ted Kennedy, and President Clinton had some really nice things to say in the Rose Garden when he signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that bipartisan, universal appreciation for religious liberty has collapsed.
Right. 27 years ago, could you ever imagine that bill coming to the floor, say, of this House right now? Maybe you don't follow the House right now, but would it ever, can you imagine it coming to the floor? Ted Kennedy and Bill Clinton's bill?
I would hope that we are still the nation that respects religious liberty as one of our founding principles, and I think that a law that was passed by a voice vote in the House and 97-0 in the Senate that we had bipartisan and support from people all across different political spectrums, I would hope that we could achieve that once again.
Okay, talk about the Establishment Clause. Do you think it's accurate to say the Establishment Clause prohibits the government from favoring non-religion over religion?
Well, the Establishment Clause, do you want to talk about the original meaning of the Establishment Clause?
Sure.
I mean, the original meaning of the Establishment Clause, as Justice Joseph Story pointed out in his commentaries on the Constitution, I believe it was around 1833, he was a former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, actually had a very limited view of the Establishment Clause as only applying, obviously, to Congress, as it says, but only as to what we would call the establishment of religion as such, that the government would set up and support a particular religion. It wouldn't be for another century and a half that the court would evolve that understanding into some of the Establishment Clause thinking that we see today.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church versus EEOC?
Yes, I'm very familiar with that. It's a unanimous decision by the U.S. Supreme Court.
But what scares me about the future of the country is a unanimous decision. First of all, you want to just briefly, in 15 seconds, describe to the crowd what the decision says?
Well, the decision essentially says that it is not the government's business to determine who is a minister, who is not for a religious organization, and that they cannot pass laws that would impose burdens on any kind on the employment of people that a religious organization determines to be a minister.
It was unanimous, huh?
Yes,
and
it was
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that crowd?
Of course.
Oh, well, yes, okay. Now, something that's not, of course, what happened in that decision on the appellate court level?
Well, it had gone the other way.
Right, 3-0, 3-0, yeah. So kind of scary in the future that there are a lot of people who graduate from our law schools who apparently don't get what the Supreme Court got, right? Earlier this year, the Trump administration issued 9 rules aimed at protecting religious organizations from unfair and unequal treatment by the government. How will these proposed rules protect constitutionally protected religious liberty?
Well, I think the most important function of the executive branch is to conform the regulations to Congress and to existing law and clearly
I'm going to give you one more
law.
question because we're limited to 5 minutes, and I'm sorry to cut you off. A lot has been said here about freedom for religious institutions, freedoms I have once I step in the doorway of a synagogue or church. Do you think those religious freedoms should disappear just because I don't work for a church or I'm not in a church?
No, and neither did our founding fathers. That's why they used the word free exercise, because the word exercise means doing things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Just one quick postscript to what you were saying about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Of course, the Supreme Court struck it down. Justice Scalia wrote the opinion arguing and holding that the Free Exercise Clause does not excuse anyone from complying with neutral, universally applicable laws. I thought we needed to get that in there. Mr. Conley, you're recognized now for 5 minutes, the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the chair. Did you say Justice Scalia wrote that?
Yes.
My. Reverend Sloan, you're with Union Theological Seminary, is that correct?
It is, yes.
So I assume from that title you've got something to do with, I don't know, religious matters.
Yes.
You know, what we've been hearing here, my friends on the other side of the aisle, is what I consider to be this false dichotomy. To propound rights for American citizens who happen to have a different sexual orientation is directly in conflict with my religious freedom. And when I weigh that dichotomy, I got to come down on religious freedom because otherwise it's an assault on my religious freedom. from the perspective of where you work and your own religious orientation, what's your view about that? Is religion being put under assault if we assert LGBTQ rights?
No, absolutely not. So Union Theological is not only interdenominational, it's also interfaith. So the work that Mr. Sasser does is very important, and we would be fully in support of that. And yet, again, you know, we're making it more difficult than it needs to be. Of course you get to practice your religion, and you should, until that religion is used to discriminate. And that's exactly what's happening with LGBT people.
Just traveling down history a little bit, do you think religion was used to justify slavery?
It absolutely was, yes.
Absolutely was. And didn't some denominations actually break along the lines of North-South over that very issue, even though those were denominations? They were religious denominations.
Yes.
And did not those divisions, racial divisions, last for a very long time, even after the Civil War?
Yes, and continued to do harm.
And were biblical justifications and religious justifications used to also justify racial discrimination and segregation during the 100-year Jim Crow period?
Yes.
So we have a long history of people invoking religion for their own political purposes, one might say.
Yes. So you use the word use, but I would say it's abused. It's an abuse of Scripture. Yeah.
Even more accurate. Okay. Ms. Wibelow, HRC exists to advocate for and promote the rights of LGBTQ individuals in America. Is that correct?
That is correct, including LGBTQ people of faith.
Including LGBT people of faith. That's right. The administration has, it seems, consciously rolled back protections for LGBTQ individuals in America. Attorney General Jeff Sessions using religious liberty as a rationale to undermine protections that already were on the books or existed through executive orders for such individuals. Is that correct?
That's correct. The Attorney General has misused religious liberty in order to justify a widespread attack on LGBTQ people, erasing us from everything from websites to laws.
And we've seen that across the board in terms of transgender rights, advocacy, the federal government stepping in to protect. Now, we heard a little bit about the heavy hand of the federal government, tyrannical, I think was the word maybe used. I'm going to ask you to go down the road of history just a little bit. Do you think, just speculate with me, that if the federal government hadn't intervened, that civil rights and voting rights would have progressed nonetheless in America?
Potentially, but it would have been a long, slow road.
Well, Jim Crow was 100 years. People were still being murdered for trying to exercise their right to vote in 1964 and 65. And of course, we still see the vestiges of hate in other examples, most recently in Charleston, tragedy in Charleston. But it's hard for me to imagine, without the federal intervention, that things would have changed.
People are still being purged from voter rolls today because of their race.
Right. So sometimes that role of the federal government is about protecting the rights of everybody, even if that means an intrusive presence for those who are perpetrating discrimination for their own benefit. Is that correct?
Look, it should be the role of government to use its powers judiciously, but it is often necessary for Congress to ensure that everyone has a fair chance in this country.
I thank you. I thank the chair.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. Let's see. Okay, then the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to be clear that, one of the things that's frustrating is the administration's attack on LGBTQ plus communities started long before the recent attempts to expand religious exemptions. I think on day one, literally day one of this presidency, all mentions of LGBTQ plus rights were deleted from the White House website instantly. Religious liberty, I'm going to put it in quotation, is simply this administration's latest excuse to continue its painful oppression of other people, including our LGBTQ neighbors. This type of consistent state-sanctioned discrimination has a detrimental effect on so many of our neighbors across the country, including in my home state of Michigan. In May 2019, 2 gay men, Mr. Davis and Mr. Blanchard, and 1 transgender woman, Paris Cameron, were murdered in an anti-LGBTQ hate crime in Detroit. And in this case, it wasn't really isolated. According to the Human Rights Campaign, Ms. Cameron was one of the latest 22 transgender people murdered in 2019 alone, most of them who were women of color. Ms. Warbelow, would you agree with the American Medical Association's assessment that we face an epidemic of violence for trans women of color?
Absolutely. The fact that trans women are being murdered on our streets, particularly trans women of color, is terrifying. And it really underscores the way in which the rhetoric in our country has been ramped up to justify violence against people who are unpopular. This is a disturbing trend that has to stop.
You know, violence in its nature is fueled by systemic issues like racism, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, but there's a role for the federal government to play. The federal government can act to underscore the dignity and worth of transgender people. The federal government can provide legal protections for transgender individuals when they encounter discrimination in their workplaces or in their schools. The federal government can prosecute hate crimes. It can create better reporting systems. It can train law enforcement on safeguarding transgender and gender nonconforming people from violence. Ms. Warbelow, in your opinion, do robust legal protections for transgender people matter as we seek to combat violence against transgender neighbors across the country?
The government, as you mentioned, needs to take a robust, comprehensive approach to ending violence against the LGBTQ community, particularly transgender people. No one single law or enforcement is enough. And even when the laws are on the books, we have to have an administration who is willing to enforce those laws and take seriously the day-to-day experiences of our neighbors and our siblings.
And Reverend Sloan, do you agree? Mr. Oliveras?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Minton?
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for recognizing our transgender siblings, especially our transgender siblings of color who are being murdered on the streets.
And I ask my colleagues, especially members of Congress, before you make decisions about people, sit down with them and actually talk to them. I don't want to cry because I do this all the time to myself, but you know, when you actually look at a person as a fellow human being, and when sitting there at a press conference as a mother with another mother that lost her child just because she was transgender, it's very painful. Like, talk to them as fellow human beings. They're people. And it's really frustrating, especially those that come from a place of faith, that they could just take away somebody's human dignity and say that they're less than, that they're disposable. And just watching this mother say, but she was the most kindest woman ever. And all she wanted to be was free to express herself, free to be whatever she wanted to be. But that's what our country is supposed to be about, right? If I want to be a, unapologetic Muslim Palestinian woman who wants to speak up about other people's oppression, I should be able to do that and not be labeled as some sort of person that's somehow less American because I speak up for other people's rights or just because of my identity, and then trying to use that and fuel that kind of discrimination. So I just don't feel like anybody in our country should live in fear of being who they are. And we must do more to uplift these issues. But I always tell people, especially my neighbors who come all throughout 13 District Strong to town halls saying, Rashida, can we really talk about like transgender people? I don't want my kids to do that. And I look at them and I said, have you ever met a trans woman? Have you ever met a trans person? Like, have you ever talked to somebody in the LGBTQ community? Many of them have not. They haven't encountered. Some of them, I told them, you probably don't even know. Just like many of my colleagues probably have never served with a Muslim woman ever before. I mean, they're probably in shock right now, but they are experiencing it for their first time. But I hope they see the passion or the thing because of my family's own oppression, my family's experience of being othered, of living in fear of who they are. And so I just thank you all for your leadership, but I think we need to be truthful and honest with ourselves of who we are if we're really going to be this country that we are about everyone truly being free, completely and utterly, and not using faith or anything like that to infuse fear, which later infuses violence. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tlaib. The gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Holland, is now recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you all so much for being here today. There are more than 400,000 children in foster care across the country, 400,000 children hoping to find a family to call home and love them unconditionally. This administration is trying to make it more difficult for these children to find homes and for LGBTQ couples to adopt by supporting discrimination. And on Monday, the Supreme Court announced that it would take up a court case involving foster care to determine if states may act against discrimination or if they have to fund organizations determined to keep discriminating against the LGBTQ community. My daughter is queer. Every official involved in making these choices should have to look her in the eye and explain why her life should have been difficult if she were in foster care and why she should be discriminated against if she wants to give a child a home. Last year, I had the privilege of meeting Daryl Conquering Bear, an enrolled member of the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe and foster youth alumni. He is also Two-Spirit. When he came out to his foster parents, they kicked him out. After that experience, he went back into the closet until last year. Chairwoman Maloney, I have Chairman Raskin, I have Daryl Conquering Bear's testimony in support of the Every Child Deserves a Family Act and experience in foster care system, and I would like to submit that for the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Livadas, thank you for being here today. You and Daryl both had to deal with injustice in foster care, and I would like to take a few minutes to ask you more about you and your experience. You mentioned in your testimony that you spent 5 years in the Texas foster care system, starting at the age of 13. What was it like having to navigate the foster care system as you were just becoming a teenager and figuring out who you are, including your sexuality?
Thank you. It was very difficult. It was scary. It was very lonely. As I mentioned in my testimony, I was placed 180 miles away from my home city, and it was me and my brother. My brother was 1.5 years younger than I was, and so it was not all those feelings, but it was also trying to step in and be that parent for him, and balancing all that with the sexuality battle that I was feeling inside. It made it extremely difficult, which is when the suppressing started.
You mentioned the fears you felt when you went to church with your foster family or when you were called terrible slurs in your foster home. Were there times you thought you'd rather be homeless than live under those conditions?
Yes, absolutely. There were so many nights that I stayed up crying because I was so miserable and I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know who to turn to. I didn't feel comfortable or safe opening up to anybody. And I would go to school the next day and just be so tired and sleepy, just thinking, would it be worth it just to step out of this house and never come back?
What difference could be more supportive homes and families make for the next generation of LGBTQ youth in the foster care system?
I think the first step is just eliminating discrimination, which the Every Child Deserves a Family Act would do. Right now in my state, foster children are subjected to conversion therapy, a discredited practice attempting to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. They say that discrimination, sometimes doesn't exist, but it's not just existing for foster parents or adoption parents, it's for these young adults in foster care.
Thank you very much for your bravery in coming before the committee today. You're a powerful voice for change, and we're fortunate to have you in this fight, so thank you very much. I have a few more seconds. I'd like to turn to Reverend Sloan. A recent study found that as many as 30% of youth in the foster care system identify as a member of the LGBTQ community. Another study found that more than half of LGBTQ youth surveyed had at some point chosen to live on the street rather than in their foster home placement because they felt safer there. Reverend Sloan, why do LGBTQ youth disproportionately experience homelessness, and what dangers does homelessness pose to LGBTQ youth?
So the reasons why LGBTQ people are more likely to be homeless start very young. As they come in touch with who they are and they come out, oftentimes they are kicked out of their homes. Then if you add to that the harm that is done in the child welfare sector as it is to LGBTQ people, that further contributes to that. That cycle of poverty that starts young does not stop there, and it continues throughout LGBTQ people's experience. Up to a third of people who are in LGBTQ need food assistance. This is a cycle that starts young and that the current systems to support getting out of it don't allow for. And a lot of times that's on the basis of religious discrimination.
Thank you so much, and I yield, Chairman.
Thank you very much. And now the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. I am experiencing this hearing, and I'm struggling whether I respond or launch into this question as a legislator or from the perspective of a woman of faith. Because I cannot, it's very difficult to sit here and listen to arguments in the long history of this country of using scripture and weaponizing and abusing scripture to justify bigotry. White supremacists have done it. Those who justified slavery did it. Those who fought against integration did it. And we're seeing it today. And sometimes, especially in this body, I feel as though if Christ himself walked through these doors and said what he said thousands of years ago, that we should love our neighbor and our enemy, that we should welcome the stranger, fight for the least of us, that it is easier for a rich man, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into a kingdom of heaven, he would be maligned as a radical and rejected from these doors. And I know, and it is part of my faith, that all people are holy and all people are sacred, unconditionally. And that is what makes faith sometimes, that's what prompts us to transform, because it is unconditional. It's not about that it is up to us to love parts of people. We love all people. There is nothing holy about rejecting medical care of people, no matter who they are on the grounds of what their identity is. There is nothing holy about turning someone away from a hospital. There's nothing holy about rejecting a child from a family. There's nothing holy about writing discrimination into the law. And I am tired of communities of faith being weaponized and being mischaracterized because the only time religious freedom is invoked is in the name of bigotry and discrimination. I'm tired of it. My faith commands me to treat Mr. Minton as holy because he is sacred, because his life is sacred, because you are not to be denied anything that I am entitled to, that we are equal in the eyes of the law, and we are equal in my faith in the eyes of the world. And so I just have to get that out ahead of time, because it is deeply disturbing, not just what is happening here, but what this administration is advancing is the idea that religion and faith is about exclusion. It is not up to us. It is not up to us to deny medical care. It is up to us to feed the hungry, to clothe the poor, to protect children, and to love all people as ourselves. Now, I want to take a moment to acknowledge a trans woman from my district. I represent Rikers Island. And I want to acknowledge the life of Leilene Polanco, because Leilene was being held on $500 bail at Rikers Island, and she was put in solitary confinement. She was trans, and she was neglected because of it. Polanco's family claimed in a lawsuit that her daughter's death on June 7th occurred as a result of personnel who failed to provide her safe housing, adequate medical care, and proper accommodation for her disabilities. She was 27 years old, and her life was taken because of who she was. There is nothing holy about that. Nothing. Ms. Warbelow, the Human Rights Campaign has done a great deal of work in the area, particularly around trans women of color and protections of trans people. Is it correct that many transgender and gender nonconforming people experience a mosaic of marginalization, homelessness, poverty, unemployment, denial of medical services, and abuse by law enforcement?
And when they experience all of those things and they go to seek the critical benefits that the government provides, they're turned away once again, humiliated once again, and experience discrimination just for trying to survive.
I'm sorry, I believe my time has expired.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Mr. Sarbanes is now recognized for his, oh, forgive me, you're next, Mr. Sarbanes. Ms. Presley from Massachusetts is recognized for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to just say I associate myself with the impassioned Christian grace and words expressed by my colleague, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, a moment ago. Last year, I introduced the Ending Push Out Act to reverse the criminalization and marginalization of Black and brown LGBTQ+ youth and cisgender girls in our schools. LGBTQ students, especially gender nonconforming students, are up to 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary treatment, even though gay and transgender youth are often the victims rather than the aggressors in school conflicts. The Ending Push-Out Act, which I introduced, would invest in the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, the sole office charged with holding schools accountable if discriminating against students. Meanwhile, under the failed leadership of Education Secretary Betsy Devos, the OCR has abdicated this critically important responsibility. In February 2018, Secretary DeVos announced the OCR will no longer investigate any transgender discrimination claims in schools, and according to the Center for American Progress, LGBTQ-related complaints were 9 times less likely to be investigated under this administration than under the Obama administration. Ms. Warbelow, what are some of the consequences of the Trump administration's decisions not to protect one of our most vulnerable student populations?
Not only will these students experience discrimination in schools that goes unchecked, teachers feel disempowered to address the discrimination they see in front of them, and sometimes teachers and administrators are actually engaging in the discrimination themselves. And when students face discrimination in education, they are more likely to end up a part of the homeless population that we were discussing previously. They're more likely to end up in that cycle of poverty and to need the services that the government so critically provides. And yet there too, they experience discrimination because we have not closed the gaps. We have not passed laws like the Equality Act that are absolutely fundamental to ensuring equality for all Americans in this country.
And the data does support the fact that elevated rates of PTSD among our LGBTQ children, trauma linked to bullying, familial and religious rejection, higher rates of homelessness, all lead to emotional distress, self-harm, and suicidal behavior. Ms. Warbelow, in what ways has this administration undermined the ability for schools to respond to trauma in LGBTQ students?
This administration has discouraged students from seeking the appropriate care and support of school districts. It's allowed school districts to turn a blind eye and has encouraged school districts by rescinding critical questions on data collection instruments from understanding what the actual needs of the LGBTQ population are.
A moment ago, Representative Ocasio-Cortez brought into the room the tragic loss of life of a trans woman in her district, and I want to bring into the space the loss of life of a or rather a transgender man in my district who was denied health care. We know that discrimination against transgender individuals is pervasive in health care. In my home state of Massachusetts, Alexander Pangborn, a hospice nurse and transgender man, was denied medically necessary gender-affirming health care by his employer. He works 40 hours a week for this company, delivering care to people in their twilight years, and yet was denied medically necessary care in return. This administration is reversing protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity in the Department of Health and Human Services and under the ACA. This means that people denied care who cannot afford a lawyer are denied justice. Mr. Minton, thank you for sharing your personal experience. What threat is posed when transgender individuals are denied gender-affirming care and lack of a pathway to justice?
I mean, the threat that is posed is anywhere from the lasting scars that are in my life and in my heart to death.
Great. This administration continues to abandon our LGBTQ+ neighbors by removing protections and barricading justice for the most vulnerable while funneling taxpayer dollars into discriminatory organizations. They think that by denying shelter and life-saving medical care, by starving, expelling, and incarcerating LGBTQI people, they will disappear. They will just simply disappear. And this is abuse, plain and simple, and we just can't stand for it. Last August, our committee joined in a multi-committee bicameral investigation to understand how a rule greenlighting this kind of anti-LGBT discrimination in healthcare was developed, as well as who was behind it. Ms. Warblow, could you explain how this refusal rule would further entrench marginalization of the LGBTQ community?
By taking what is a statutory requirement and expanding it out of control, the administration is encouraging discrimination in a wide variety of healthcare situations, including access to PrEP, treatment for HIV/AIDS, fertility care treatment and access, and we know that hospitals are turning away trans patients not only for transition-related care, but also for things like having a broken ankle. We've heard of a home nurse that refused to bathe a gay man because she believed that he was a sinner. She was his sole caretaker in a medical context. I can only imagine what people are doing to their trans patients.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. And now, thank you, Mr. Sarbanes, for your patience. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Maloney, Chairwoman Maloney, and also the ranking member for holding this important hearing. First of all, I want to thank the witnesses. Thank you for your courageous and thoughtful testimony in helping the committee with its work. I do want to repudiate this notion that's been floated here today that people of faith and the LGBTQ community are mutually exclusive. We have a huge population of LGBTQ plus members of our society across this nation that unabashedly celebrate their faith, and we have to acknowledge that. I also hold the deeply held belief that the object of our society and of our government should be to create a nation where every child born into this society should be valued and protected and supported and loved, whether that child is LGBTQ plus or straight, and that should be a national goal toward a more perfect union. That's where we should be headed. On January 16th, President Trump announced that 9 federal agencies would be proposing new rules that heighten the risk that faith-based service providers might impose proscriptive religious practices on those seeking taxpayer-funded services. So those include Department of Justice, Homeland Security, HHS, Energy, Labor, Agriculture, USAID, and the VA. And we're still waiting for HUD to come forward with their regulations. And these regulations impact preschool, foster care, disaster recovery aid, substance abuse treatment, and much more. And under those rules, faith-based providers will no longer have to inform individuals that they're not going to be required to participate in religious practices. They're not required to inform individuals coming for services that there's a secular alternative. If they come to a religious hospital, that institution is not required to say, hey, there's a place down the street that will also provide your services. So in my own district, we had to deal with, a few years ago, a suicide cluster. 14 young boys took their lives in about 18 months. And I founded a residential drug rehab and recovery home for adolescents, because up until that point, we were co-locating children in adult facilities, and it did not work out. But Reverend Sloan, from your testimony, you're dealing with the same demographic, right? And so tell me how this, in your view, you're doing this on a regular basis in Chicago, tell me how this affects those kids, you know, because a lot of these kids are coming from homes that there's no support there. They're detached. They've got nothing. They're sort of just out there. How does this unwillingness of the administration to deliver these taxpayer-funded services in a way that's not open to all, how is that affecting the kids that you're seeing?
So discrimination based on religion is wrong, and it hurts in general. But when it comes to emergency services, it is life and death itself most often. And so denying these kids, or even adults who come for emergency services, denying them on the basis of religious discrimination is extremely serious. If I could, I would
Please,
also...
go ahead. Go ahead.
I would also like to just kind of, you mentioned that, you know, the idea of being LGBTQ and of being religious are not mutually exclusive, despite that perception. And I just wanted to say really where that perception comes from. That comes from this small faction of religious people who kick kids out of their homes and who, you know, build this separation for some of us in the community between religion and who they constitutionally are. And that goes forward within the faith communities themselves, and then it tragically robs the young person themselves of their spirituality.
Thankfully, not every place in America is like that. In my own lifetime, I've seen wonderful progress, and I think we need to recognize that and keep pushing for, as we say, a more perfect union.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch.
Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I come to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel today. Incredibly powerful and moving testimony. So important that we're having this hearing, and want to thank you for joining us. We've been talking about this refusal of care rule over the course of the day, which seems to be using the guise or the rationale or the pretext of religious liberty to target the right of LGBTQ people to access health care without fear of discrimination. Of course, it has other implications as well. When the Department of Health and Human Services finalized that rule last May, we perceived, obviously, that it could dramatically expand the ability of providers participating in federal health care programs to deny care to patients on supposed religious or conscious grounds. So this committee joined in a multi-committee, bicameral investigation. We really it was an all-hands-on-deck effort to understand how the rule got developed. We wanted to get behind that. What were the motivations? What was the process? Who was behind it? 6 months later, HHS has not provided answers to the committee's questions, has not produced the documents that we requested. Instead, they just keep giving us publicly available documents that don't add any perspective. It's really hard to overstate the harm that this rule could cause. Panelists have, I think, done an excellent job in helping us appreciate that harm. When you look at things, examples that have been touched on, a pharmacist who could refuse to fill a prescription for the HIV prevention drug, PrEP, for a person who's gay, a provider who could refuse to perform or assist with gender reassignment surgery for a patient, a hospital room scheduler who could refuse to assist a patient because they are trans. So far, fortunately, the rule's been blocked in the court, but we cannot take anything for granted. You've given a lot of testimony, a lot of specific testimony, but Ms. Warbelow and maybe Reverend Sloan as well, step back for me for a moment and just explain kind of in broad ways, in broad terms, broad strokes, the impact that this kind of rule, if it goes forward, is going to have, almost the shock impact, I would imagine. Because we've been on this is the case with so many issues before the Trump administration, where we felt like we were on a positive trajectory. We were making progress. We were bending the arc of the moral universe more towards justice, and then wham, the Trump administration comes in and it kind of stops all that in an instant and begins to reverse it. So if the two of you could speak to that in terms of your perspective on that, but also, because I know I will then run out of time and not be able to ask this next question, Mr. Minton, I'd like your perspective as well. I always think about how humans, when we wake up in the morning, and we're slowly kind of fluttering into consciousness and setting our coordinates for the day. Where am I? Who am I? I think about children and young people coming into consciousness. Am I warm? Is there heat in my home? Do I have a gnawing hunger, or do I feel fed? Am I safe? And so maybe, Mr. Minton, you can talk a little bit about kind of what it does to your coordinates as you're wanting to feel safe in the broader society to face the prospect of this kind of rule coming at you. So I'll give the three of you a chance to respond, and then I will be yielding back.
Even prior to this rule, LGBTQ people experience discrimination in healthcare and were less likely to seek the healthcare they need because of experiences like rough handling by doctors and nurses, forced removal of partners and loved ones from hospital and doctors' rooms, intentional misgendering, and harassment of patients. With this new rule in place, it encourages more of that bad behavior, and importantly, it discourages LGBTQ patients from seeking recourse when they experience that discrimination and bad behavior. It doesn't have to be this way. There are religiously affiliated hospitals and doctors' offices who, in their faith tradition, would never marry a same-sex couple, who would not support a gender transition, frankly, who teach that you can't achieve entrance into the kingdom of heaven based on a different belief. And yet, they ensure equal treatment of all of their patients, and that is the model that needs to be followed nationwide.
I would just add, because I want to cede to Mr. Minton, but I would just add that, again, it's not simply hospital care. When you're getting down to the homeless population and to lower incomes, it's the full variety of emergency services. And again, it's not simply just a matter of discrimination, it's a matter of life and death.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I am so scared. I am terrified. I am terrified for myself and all of my community. I can't go to my nearest emergency room. When my pharmacist accidentally overdosed me, in my life, could have literally been in jeopardy. I had to travel miles further to go to an emergency room. I have two little nieces and a nephew who are the apples of my eye. If they turn out to be LGBTQ, I don't want them to be turned away from a hospital just like I was. I want America to get better. I don't want it to get worse. I don't want our community members to be turned away. I don't want them to be ushered away for care just like I was. You're saying that the arc of history bends toward justice. I want us to get back on track. So I'm terrified, and I thank you for asking me how I feel.
All right. Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Now we come to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, who is recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Chair, I would like to enter into the record the testimony of David Dixon from Rancho Santa Margarita, a town in my district in Orange County.
Without objection, it is entered.
David Dixon and his husband were foster parents while living in Georgia and were told on several occasions that they were not receiving calls for placement because they were a, quote, non-traditional family, quote. Mr. Dixon and his husband were finally able to have children placed with them, but then when they wanted to adopt these foster youth, the foster care system dropped David and his name from all the paperwork. Only his husband was able to formally adopt the children. He was no longer recognized as their parent and had to fight to be added as a second parent, an experience that he describes as, quote, humiliating and frightening, unquote. Mr. Sloan, could you elaborate for me about how prospective LGBTQ parents have faced unnecessary discrimination while adopting children from religious organizations?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. We hear this all the time. There are stories constantly of applications to foster or to adopt being shuffled to the bottom of the pile and just running into their peers from the classes, and all of their peers had, who were straight, have kids and they still don't.
Absolutely. I want to make sure the committee is aware of data from the UCLA Law School showing that significantly more LGBTQ parents are raising an adopted or fostered child compared to male and female couples. Male-female couples. Assuming this trend continues, I have serious concerns that we will have children who will not be adopted or fostered when there are prospective loving parents who are ready and able to raise them. And the reason that these kids will not be fostered or adopted is because of discrimination under the protection of the religious freedom rule. Mr. Sloan, what do you think makes good characteristics in an application for foster parents? And do you have any concerns that you would have for prospective parents who identify as LGBTQ?
No, actually, LGBTQ parents and the children of those parents are shown consistently to rank equal, if not above, in classic determinators like high school graduation, college graduation, emotional stability. So I have zero concerns about LGBTQ people being able to parent. We are also sitting on the future millennial, 63% of millennial LGBTQ people plan on forming families. Mm-hmm. And so the pool for placements for children will grow. And if we have discrimination, the 20,000 kids who age out every year will not be finding homes.
And I just want to emphasize and get your thoughts on how these religious freedom rules are creating an economic issue. So I wonder if any of you have thoughts, starting with you, Mr. Sloan, about how there's a real cost to taxpayers, not to mention the very real human costs that come because more children remain in foster care or adoptive services because of the religious freedom rule.
Yeah, so the costs are exponential, and they don't simply stop when a child ages out of the foster care or the child service system. Children who do not find placement and do not get adopted are much more likely to become incarcerated or to live in extreme poverty, remaining a burden on our system, and at the same time as they are the real victims.
Yeah, I just want to hold up again for the witnesses the picture of this amazing family that lives in my district. And when I came into the hearing earlier this morning, I have the privilege to sit next to my colleague, Representative Holland, and we are both single mothers. And so language about broken families or family being a man and a woman. I remember I wrote to Deb, what does that mean about our families that we are proudly raising? And so I just want to say that this fight while it's very much a fight for the LGBTQ community, we also see a lot of the same kind of language and same kind of hostility to those who may be parenting alone. And so I want you to know, as the first single mother of young children to be serving in the U.S. Congress, that I am all in for loving families, and I don't like labels like traditional and non-traditional, because to me, the only family that matters is a loving one.
Believe me, we're all in with you as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
All right, and on that lovely warm note, I'm going to start to bring things to a close here. First, without objection, I'm going to enter into the record letters and statements from individuals and organizations, including the following: Queer Eyes Karamo Brown, Leslie Michelle McMurray, numerous LGBTQ children and parents who've been discriminated against in foster care and adoption who've written us, Americans United, Centerlink, Family Equality, GLSEN, Interfaith Alliance, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and Congressman Raul Grijalva, all of whom are standing in solidarity with the LGBT community today. Without objection, I will enter those. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their terrific testimony today: Mr. Olivares, Mr. Minton, Ms. Warbelow, Mr. Sasser, Reverend Sloan. We're very grateful to all of you for coming and giving us your insight. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to you for your response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able so we can complete the record. I want to thank my friend, Mr. Meadows, for his participation and patience today. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.